I've been a ranger at Yosemite Valley for 12 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at us. But what happened 3 nights ago? God help me, I still can't believe what I saw. I need to write this down while I still can. Someone needs to know the truth. It started during my regular night patrol. The moon was full, lighting up half-dome like a giant silver coin in the sky. Everything seemed normal at first, just another quiet night in the valley. Then I noticed something odd about the deer. Usually, deer move in small groups, maybe 5 or 6 at most. But that night, I counted at least 30 of them moving together through the meadow. They weren't grazing or even looking around for predators. No, they were marching. That's the only word for it. Like soldiers in formation, heads all pointed in the same direction, moving in perfect sync. I radioed back to base about it, and Sarah, my supervisor, just laughed it off. Maybe they're having a deer party, she joked. I wish she'd taken me seriously. The next morning, we got our first emergency call. A group of hikers hadn't returned from their camping trip near Mirror Lake. When we found them, Jesus, I still see it when I close my eyes. 23 bodies arranged in a perfect spiral, like some sick piece of artwork. But the worst part, they were completely drained of blood. Not a drop left in any of them. The weird thing was, there were no wounds, no bite marks, nothing to show how the blood was taken. Just small, precise holes at the base of each victim's neck, like they'd been pierced by needles. We called in the state police, of course, but while they were still setting up their investigation, 3 more groups of hikers were found, all arranged the same way, all bloodless, and every time we find fresh deer tracks all around the bodies. That's when I remembered something I'd seen years ago, deep in one of the less explored caves. I should have remembered it sooner. Maybe if I had, some of these people would still be alive. Tomorrow, I'll tell you about what we found in that cave, if I'm still here to tell it. I grabbed my flashlight and took 2 junior rangers, Mike and Jenny, to the cave I remembered. It was hidden behind a thick patch of bushes, the kind of place tourists never find. As we walked, we kept seeing more animals acting strange, squirrels moving in straight lines, birds flying in perfect formations. Not a single animal made a sound. The silence felt heavy, like the whole valley was holding its breath. The cave entrance was small, barely big enough to crawl through. Our flashlight beams bounced off the wet walls as we went deeper inside. That's when Mike's light caught something on the wall, paintings. Not the usual stick figures of hunters and deer you sometimes find. These were different. The paintings showed masses of animals, deer, bears, wolves, and birds, all gathered in circles around groups of people. But the people in the paintings were lying down, arranged in the same spiral pattern we found at Mirror Lake. My hands started shaking as I moved my light across the wall, revealing more images. There was writing too, scratched into the rock. Most of it was too worn to read, but one word kept showing up, gathering. Next to it was a drawing of the full moon with what looked like the number 167 beneath it. Jenny found something else, a small wooden box tucked into a crack in the wall. Inside was an old journal, its pages yellow and brittle. It was dated 1834, written by someone named Thomas Miller. I started reading out loud. Day 3 of the gathering. The animals have changed. They move as one now. Already 54 souls lost. They take our blood to feed something ancient, something that sleeps beneath the valley. When the moon is full, they will need 167. God help us all. Right then, our radios crackled to life. It was Sarah at the station, her voice tight with fear. All rangers report back immediately. We got hundreds of animals surrounding the visitor center. They're herding people together. This isn't natural. Whatever you're doing, drop it and get back here now. We rushed out of the cave, but what we saw stopped us cold. A line of deer stretched as far as we could see, their eyes reflecting our flashlights like hundreds of red stars. Behind them were bears, mountain lions, wolves, natural enemies standing shoulder to shoulder, all staring at us. And they were closing in. I need to stop writing for a moment. They're scratching at the station walls now. But I have to tell you what happened next before it's too late. Before they come for us too. We ran. We ran faster than I've ever run in my life. Mike tripped on a root, and I'll never forget what happened next. Two deer helped him up. Not by accident. They deliberately pushed their heads under his arms and lifted him. Their eyes weren't normal anymore. They glowed with a dull red light, like dying embers. We made it back to the ranger station just as the sun was setting. Inside, Sarah and the others had barricaded the doors and windows. Through the gaps in the boards, we could see the visitor center across the parking lot. What we saw there still haunts me. The animals had gathered about 50 tourists into a giant circle. They weren't attacking, they were organizing. Bears and mountain lions stood guard while smaller animals, raccoons and squirrels, moved between the terrified people, as if counting them. One woman tried to run. A line of deer simply stepped in front of her, guiding her back like sheepdogs herding sheep. We tried calling for help. The phones were dead. Radio signals couldn't get through, just static and a strange humming sound. We could see the red and blue lights of police cars up on the ridge, but the animals had blocked every road into the valley with fallen trees and rock slides. That's when Jenny remembered the journal's warning. They'd take our blood to feed something ancient. She pointed to the ground beneath our feet. What if it's down there? What if that's why they're gathering people here? As if answering her question, the ground trembled, just a little at first, like a distant truck passing. Then harder. The coffee cups on the desk started dancing. Through the window, we saw the tourists at the visitor center falling silent, their eyes going wide with terror. The animals were changing position. The smaller ones backed away while the larger ones, bears, mountain lions, deer, formed a giant circle around the visitor center. In perfect unison, they'd all turned their heads to stare at our ranger station. Then, as the moon rose over Half Dome, they started walking toward us. Not running or charging, just walking, step by step, closing in from all sides. And behind them came the birds, thousands of them, blocking out the moonlight. Sarah tried counting the people they gathered so far. 142, she whispered. They still need 25 more to reach 167. There were exactly 25 of us in the ranger station. I have to pause again. The scratching at the walls has stopped. Now I hear something worse, chewing. They're eating their way in. I need to hurry and tell you about our last stand, about what we found beneath the station, about why I'm the only one left. The chewing sounds got louder. Through holes in the walls, we could see bears and deer taking turns, biting and tearing at the wood. But they weren't angry or wild. Their movements were careful, planned, like they were following instructions. We retreated to the basement. That's when Mike noticed something odd about the floor. One section sounded hollow when we walked on it. We moved the old filing cabinets and found a trapdoor, its edges black with age. Sarah didn't want to open it. Whatever's down there is what they're feeding, she said. But we could hear the walls upstairs starting to crack. We had no choice. The trapdoor opened to a narrow tunnel that seemed to go straight down into the rock. As we shone our flashlights down, cool air rushed up, brimming the smell like old copper and wet stone. And something else, a deep humming sound, the same one we'd heard on the radio. That's when the ceiling gave way. Animals poured into the basement like a flood. Deer, wolves, bears, and birds all moving together like they were parts of one big creature. Their eyes all glowed that same red color. In the chaos, I saw terrible things. Raccoons working together to drag people toward the tunnel. Birds flying in formations to herd us like cattle. Bears gently picking up struggling rangers in their mouths. Jenny tried to fight back with a chair. A deer, just a regular deer, picked it up with its teeth and tossed it aside like it was nothing. Then the deer looked at her with those glowing eyes, and Jenny just stopped fighting. She started walking toward the tunnel on her own, like she was in a trance. One by one, I watched my friends disappear down that black hole. Their screams echoed back up, then suddenly stopped. The animals worked with horrible patience, never rushing, never making a mistake. They knew they had us. I saw Sarah last. As a bear was carrying her to the tunnel, she caught my eye and managed to throw me something, the old journal from the cave. Then she whispered one word, "Run." I ran. God help me, I ran. Somehow, I made it to the emergency exit. As I sprinted into the night, I could hear it, a sound no human throat could make, rising from deep underground. It sounded like joy. I'm writing this in a small supply shed near the park boundary. They'll find me soon. I can hear them outside, moving in the dark. But someone needs to know what happened here. Someone needs to know that every 10 years, when the moon is full in October, the animals of Yosemite gather. They gather for something that sleeps beneath the valley, something that can only wake when it's fed exactly 167 souls. The door is opening now. Their eyes are so bright in the dark. So bright, the rest of the page is covered in blood. Below it, written in shaking letters, October 2034. The next gathering begins. Official Park Service report, October 17, 1934. When we finally reached Yosemite Valley 3 days after losing radio contact, everything looked normal. Too normal. The morning sun lit up the valley like any other day. Birds sang. Deer grazed peacefully in the meadows. If it wasn't for the empty cars in the parking lots and the broken windows of the ranger station, you'd never know anything had happened. We found this journal in a small maintenance shed near the park border. The blood on these pages matches Ranger James Cooper's, but we never found his body. We never found any bodies. What we did find was this: empty tents at every campsite, some with food still warm on camp stoves. Footprints leading to the ranger station, then stopping suddenly. Strange circular patterns pressed into the grass near Mirror Lake. A massive hole beneath the ranger station, leading to a tunnel system we never knew existed, and claw marks. Claw marks everywhere, but no blood except for on this journal. The strangest thing was the animals. Park biologists reported that every native species, from the smallest chipmunk to the largest bear, showed unusually low numbers for exactly 3 days. Then on the 4th day, they all reappeared. Normal. Calm. Like nothing ever happened. We're sealing off the tunnel beneath the ranger station. The official story is that a gas leak caused mass hallucinations, followed by a tragic accident. The missing people will be declared lost in various hiking accidents. But I know what really happened. I read this journal 3 times, and last night I saw something that makes me believe every word. I was locking up the new ranger station when I spotted a deer standing perfectly still in the parking lot. It turned to look at me, and just for a second, I swear its eyes glowed red in the darkness. In its mouth was a scrap of cloth that looked exactly like Ranger Cooper's uniform. Then it spoke, not with a voice, but somehow I heard it in my head. 10 years, we'll need 167 again. It laid down the cloth scrap and walked away, its hooves clicking on the pavement in a rhythm that sounded almost like counting. I'm requesting an immediate transfer, but I'm also leaving this journal where someone will find it. If you're reading this in October 2034, get out of Yosemite Valley before the full moon. Get out and don't look back. The animals will be hungry again. Note: the original copy of this report was marked classified and sealed in 1934. The journal itself vanished from park records in 1944. Every 10 years since then, during the October full moon, an average of 167 people have been reported missing in Yosemite National Park. The next full moon is coming. It was early May when everything went wrong on Mount Rainier. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though I'm an old man now. I was 28 then, working as a rescue ranger at the national park. We'd seen all kinds of weather up there, but nothing like what was coming. That morning started like any other spring day on the mountain. The sky was clear, and we had reports of about 89 climbers spread out across different routes. Some were experienced mountaineers, others were just regular folks looking for adventure. I remember chatting with a group at the base station, a family of 4, a couple of college students, and some hiking clubs. They were all so excited, taking photos and checking their gear. Nobody paid much attention to the weird cloud that appeared around noon. Up in the mountains, weather can change fast, so a single dark cloud didn't worry us much. But I noticed something odd about it. The cloud seemed to move wrong. Instead of drifting with the wind, it sort of crawled across the sky, like spilled ink spreading across paper. By early afternoon, we started getting the first radio calls about sudden temperature drops. Not just normal cold, but the kind that freezes water bottles solid in minutes. A few experienced climbers decided to turn back. Smart move, as it turned out, but most pushed on, thinking they could handle a little bad weather. I'll never forget the moment when that cloud settled over the peak. The radio chatter suddenly got frantic. Multiple groups reported their compasses spinning wildly and their GPS devices, which were pretty new back then, just stopped working altogether. Then the screaming started. The last clear transmission we got was from Sarah Chen, one of our most experienced guides. Her voice was shaking when she called in. There's something in the snow. It's not just falling, it's reaching. Oh God, it's reaching for us. That was when we knew this wasn't going to be a normal rescue operation. We just didn't realize yet how bad it would get. What happened next still gives me nightmares. Within minutes, the temperature dropped so low that our thermometers couldn't even read it. The wind didn't howl like normal storms, it whispered, almost like it was speaking. I grabbed my rescue gear and joined the first response team, even though something in my gut told me to stay away. Johnson, look at this, my partner Tom said, holding up his radio. The device was covered in a strange, glassy ice that seemed to crawl up from the buttons. When he tried to brush it off, it just spread faster. We'd never seen anything like it. As we climbed higher, the snow changed. Normal snow falls down, right? But this snow moved sideways, sometimes even upward. It would swirl around us in perfect circles, like it was watching us. The worst part, we started finding the first victims. They weren't just frozen, they were perfectly preserved, like statues. The first group we found was a family of 4, all standing in mid-step. Their faces looked peaceful, as if they'd just stopped for a quick rest. But their skin, it had this bluish glow, and when our flashlights hit them, something inside seemed to shift. They're still warm, whispered Jenny, our medical expert, her voice shaking. How can they be warm in this cold? We tried to radio for backup, but all we got was this weird crackling sound, like ice breaking. Then we heard it, a sound I'll never forget, like thousands of tiny wind chimes made of ice, all tinkling at once. It came from everywhere and nowhere. That's when we saw the first body move. Not the whole body, just parts of it. The ice covering the victim's skin began to pulse with a faint blue light. Their frozen eyes stayed closed, but something was definitely happening inside them. We need to get out of here now, I shouted. But as we turned to leave, we realized the snow around us had formed a perfect circle, and it was closing in. The rescue mission was quickly becoming a nightmare. We lost contact with 3 more rescue teams that day. The ones who made it back, well, they weren't the same. They kept talking about voices in the snow, about how the ice was collecting people. By nightfall, we knew we were dealing with something that no rescue manual could have prepared us for. The storm wasn't just killing people, it was keeping them. And somehow, I knew this was just the beginning. The next morning, more rescue teams arrived from nearby cities. None of us wanted to go back up there, but we had to. There were still dozens of people missing. I remember one of the new guys, Mike, saying how easy this would be. He'd done hundreds of rescues, he said. I wish I could forget the look on his face 6 hours later. Base camp, this is Team 3. My radio crackled. We found another group. It's different this time. I was in the command center when they sent the photos. The climbers they found were standing in a perfect circle, all facing inward. Their bodies were frozen solid, but here's the weird part. They were connected by streams of ice, like veins running from one person to another. When the rescue team got closer, they could see something flowing through these ice veins, something dark. Don't touch them, I yelled into the radio, but it was too late. One of the new rangers, trying to break the ice between victims, got some of that dark stuff on his glove. We watched in horror through the camera feed as the ice spread up his arm in seconds. He didn't even have time to scream. More reports kept coming in. Each group of victims we found was arranged differently, some in circles, others in lines, a few in strange patterns I can't even describe. But they all had those ice veins connecting them. It was like they were being linked together into some kind of frozen network. The military showed up that afternoon. They brought all kinds of special equipment to measure the ice in the bodies. One scientist told me something that still keeps me up at night. The frozen people that weren't exactly dead. Their bodies were being used, like batteries in some giant frozen machine. Look at these readings, she said, showing me her instruments. There's energy flowing between them. It's like they're feeding something. That's when we started finding the rescue teams who'd gone missing the day before. They were just like the others now. Frozen, connected, being used by whatever was in that storm, but their faces, they looked like they knew exactly what was happening to them. We lost 34 rescue workers that day. Good people, experienced climbers, all of them now part of that thing's frozen collection. And the storm, it was still growing stronger. By day 3, we finally understood what we were dealing with. I wish we had. The military scientists found something when they tested the ice. It wasn't just frozen water. It was alive, and it was getting smarter. Watch this, Dr. Peterson said, showing me a time-lapse video. It showed a frozen body over 24 hours. The ice wasn't just preserving it, it was slowly moving through it, like water through a sponge. Every few hours, the body would get a little thinner, a little more empty. The ice was eating them, but taking its time, keeping them fresh. The worst part, we could see it happening to the new victims too. A college student we found that morning looked perfectly normal, just frozen. By evening, his skin had started to sink in, like a deflating balloon. The ice inside him was glowing brighter though. Sir, a young ranger burst into the command center. You need to see this. He showed us his phone. He'd managed to get some pictures before his drone froze. The images showed something that made my blood run cold. All those bodies, all those frozen people connected by ice veins, they formed a pattern. From above, you could see it clearly. The whole thing looked like a giant snowflake, but wrong. More like a web. And at the center, there's something big in there, the ranger said, his voice shaking. Something moving. We sent in a team with flamethrowers, the military's idea. They never came back, but their body cameras kept transmitting for a while. The footage showed the ice actually catching the flames, freezing them somehow. Then the cameras showed hundreds of frozen faces in the ice walls, all still perfectly preserved, all slowly being consumed. That's when we heard it. A deep cracking sound, like a frozen lake breaking apart. But it wasn't random. It had a rhythm, like a heartbeat. The thing in the mountain was waking up. One of our scientists, Dr. Chen, figured it out too late. It's not just preserving them, she said, her voice trembling. It's learning from them. Every person it takes, every brain it freezes, it's adding their memories, their knowledge to itself. She looked at me with pure fear in her eyes. And now it knows enough. That evening, the temperature dropped another 30 degrees. The storm clouds started moving in ways clouds definitely shouldn't. And we could all hear it now, that horrible ice heartbeat, getting stronger by the minute. When the sun set on day 4, we finally saw what we were really fighting. The storm cleared for just a few minutes, and the full moon lit up the mountain. I'll never forget what we saw. The entire peak was covered in a giant ice structure, like a beehive made of glass. But instead of bees, it held people. Hundreds of them, all connected by those glowing ice veins. Some were climbers, some were rescue workers, but now they were all part of whatever this thing was. Look at their faces, whispered Tom, my old partner. He was right. All the frozen people were smiling now. Not normal smiles, but wide, empty grins, like they knew something we didn't. Then we saw movement inside the ice. Not from the people. They were long past moving on their own. No, this was something else, something huge. Through the clear ice walls, we could see a shape shifting, like a giant jellyfish made of frost. Wherever it moved, the frozen bodies pulsed with that blue light. The military brought in tanks and heavy weapons. They tried everything, explosives, flamethrowers, even special chemicals that were supposed to melt any kind of ice. Nothing worked. The ice just absorbed everything we threw at it, growing stronger each time. It's not just big, it's smart, said Dr. Chen, looking at her readings. Every person it takes adds to its intelligence. It's like a computer downloading more memory. She looked up at me, terrified. And it's almost done learning what it needs. That's when it started reaching out. Long fingers of ice stretched down the mountain, looking for more people to add to its collection. They moved fast, faster than anyone could run. We lost 3 more rescue teams in just an hour. The ice fingers weren't just grabbing people anymore. They were grabbing machinery too. We watched in horror as they pulled tanks and helicopters into the hive, covering them in that strange, living ice. The thing was learning how our weapons worked and making them part of itself. By midnight, the military commanders made a call. This thing, whatever it was, couldn't be allowed to grow any bigger. They said they had no choice. They had to use the nuclear option. We evacuated dawn, the general told us. Then we end this. But as we started packing up base camp, the storm clouds began moving again. And this time, they were spreading out in all directions. The thing in the ice wasn't planning to stay on the mountain anymore. They dropped the bomb at sunrise. I was in a helicopter, watching from what they said was a safe distance. The flash was so bright it turned the whole sky white. For a moment, we thought it worked. The ice structure started to melt. But then something went wrong. Very wrong. The melting ice didn't disappear. Instead, it turned into clouds. Strange, shimmering clouds that rose up into the sky. Inside them, we could still see those blue pulses, like heartbeats. The thing hadn't died. It had evolved. My God, the general whispered. We made it airborne. The clouds started spreading, moving in ways clouds shouldn't. Wherever they went, it started to snow. But this wasn't normal snow. It was that same living ice, falling from the sky in tiny crystals. Each flake contained a tiny piece of that thing's intelligence, a fragment of its hunger. The weather reports came in fast. Seattle was getting snow in summer, then Portland, then Vancouver. Every city the clouds passed over got a dusting of that strange, shimmering snow. And in each place, people started disappearing. That was 67 years ago. I'm an old man now, but I still check the weather every day. Sometimes when it snows, I look really close at the flakes that land on my window. Most are normal, but every once in a while, I see one that glows with that faint blue light. One that moves just a little wrong. One that seems to be watching me. They never found all the bodies from that day on Mount Rainier. The official report says 123 people died, 89 climbers and 34 rescue workers. But that's not quite right. They're not all dead. Parts of them are still out there, scattered in millions of tiny ice crystals, waiting to come together again. Every winter since then, there are a few cases. People who go missing in snowstorms, their bodies found later in strange positions, perfectly preserved. The government keeps it quiet, but I know what's happening. That thing is still out there, still hungry, still learning. It's just being patient now, taking its time, spreading bit by bit with every snowfall. So next time you're out in the snow and you feel a cold that goes deeper than normal cold should go, pay attention. If you see ice moving in ways it shouldn't, or hear what sounds like whispers in the wind, don't stop. Don't look back, just run. Because that thing from Mount Rainier, it's still growing, still spreading, and somewhere in those countless snowflakes falling around us, there are pieces of everyone it took that day, watching, waiting, and smiling those empty smiles. I've been a ranger at Redwood National Forest for 12 years, and every spring we do the same thing, count the wildlife. It's usually boring work. Walk the trails, mark down how many deer you see, count bird nests, that sort of thing. But what happened in the spring of 1968 changed everything. It started with the numbers being wrong, really wrong. My team was counting deer in the eastern section, and the numbers didn't make sense. Usually, we'd spot maybe 30 to 40 deer in that area, but our count showed zero. Not a single deer, not even tracks. But the weird thing was, all the deer from other areas seemed to be missing too. Hey Sarah, are you getting any weird readings in your sector? I called over the radio to my colleague. Jim, I was just about to call you. Her voice crackled back. Something's not right. There's no rabbits, no squirrels, nothing. It's like everything just left. We decided to check the old grove, that part of the forest where the trees are so old and thick that the sunlight barely reaches the ground. The locals always said to stay away from there, but we had a job to do. That's when things got strange. The deeper we went into the grove, the quieter it got. No bird songs, no rustling leaves, just silence. But there was something else, a smell, like old meat left in the sun too long. We found the first ranger's backpack near the biggest redwood I'd ever seen, just sitting there like someone had carefully placed it. The weird part, the pack was covered in some kind of sticky sap, but redwoods don't make sap like that. And the sap, it was tinted red. I radioed for backup, and soon we had a whole team out there. 5 of them went to check the far side of the grove. They never came back. We found their equipment later, half sunk into the bark of different trees, like the wood had grown around it. By the end of that first week, 15 rangers had gone missing. But the worst part wasn't the disappearances. It was realizing that the forest seemed to be getting thicker. Trees that I swear weren't there before started showing up on our maps. And at night, if you listened carefully, you could hear something that sounded like, well, like the trees were breathing. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but we all knew something was hunting in our forest, something big, and it wasn't anything we'd ever counted in our senses before. That was just the beginning of our nightmare in the redwoods. Looking back, I wish we'd burned that whole grove down when we had the chance. The head office finally took us seriously after those first 15 rangers disappeared. They sent in a bigger team, 30 people, with better equipment and even some scientists. I remember standing at the grove's edge during their arrival, watching them unload their fancy gear, thinking how none of it would help if the forest decided to take them too. "We'll set up base camp here," Dr. Miller, their team leader, said. She seemed smart but had that city look about her, like someone who'd only seen forests in pictures. "No one goes into the grove alone. Everyone carries a radio and emergency flares." I wanted to tell her that radios didn't work right in there anymore. The signals would get weird, like something was blocking them. But she'd learned that soon enough. They set up cameras on the trees and started taking samples. The first weird thing they found was in the tree rings. When they tried to date the old redwoods, the rings didn't make sense. They went deeper than any tree should, way deeper. On the third day, one of their scientists, Dr. Chen, called everyone over to look at something strange on one of the biggest trees. There were marks on the bark, not like animal claw marks, but more like, well, like the tree had grown fingers and grabbed something. And stuck in these marks were pieces of cloth that matched the uniforms of our missing rangers. "The wood samples are showing impossible readings," Dr. Chen told me, his voice shaking a bit. "The cells, they're not normal tree cells. They're changing, adapting, like the whole forest is." He stopped talking when we heard the scream. It came from the north side of the grove. By the time we got there, we found another empty uniform pressed into the bark of a tree that I swear wasn't there that morning. The tree's surface was moving slightly, like something breathing under a blanket. That night, we saw it happen. Young Tommy, one of our new rangers, was standing watch. The ground under him started moving, like water rippling. Before anyone could reach him, roots, at least they looked like roots, shot up from the ground. They weren't normal roots. They moved too fast, too purposefully. Poor Tommy didn't even have time to scream. Dr. Miller ordered everyone to pull back, but it was too late. The trees had spread out while we weren't looking, cutting off our escape route. What used to be a clear path was now blocked by thick trunks that seemed to have grown overnight. And in the bark of these new trees, if you look closely, you could see faces, frozen in fear. The forest wasn't just killing people. It was consuming them, and somehow, impossibly, using them to grow stronger. I remember Dr. Miller's last words before she ordered the emergency evacuation. "This isn't a forest, it's a mouth, and we're all standing right inside it." After Dr. Miller's team ran, the government sent in people wearing hazmat suits. They brought machines I'd never seen before, the kind that could look deep underground. What they found made me wish I'd never set foot in these woods. "The roots aren't normal," one of the scientists explained to me, pointing at some pictures on his screen. "They're all connected, every single tree. But look here." He showed me something that made my stomach turn. Inside the root system were spaces, like rooms. And in these spaces were things that used to be people. I say used to be, because the forest wasn't just killing them. It was changing them, breaking them down slowly. The trees were literally digesting people, like how a Venus flytrap digests flies. But this was happening on a massive scale. One morning, we found Sarah's radio. Sarah was one of the first rangers to go missing. The radio was stuck in a tree, but it was still working. Through the static, We could hear breathing. Not human breathing. It was deeper, slower, like the sound a whale makes underwater. It was coming from the tree itself. The whole forest is alive, the lead scientist said. Not just alive like normal trees. It's one big thing, thinking and hunting together. Those old stories about haunted forests, they weren't stories, they were warnings. We tried cutting down some of the trees. The chainsaws barely made a scratch, and the few cuts we did make, they bled. Real blood. And at night, we could hear the trees growing back, faster than anything natural should. The worst part came when it rained. The raindrops falling through the leaves picked up something from the trees, some kind of powder or pollen. Anyone who got this rain on them started feeling weird. They'd walk toward the old grove like they were in a trance. We lost 30 more people that way before we figured it out. By now, the forest had taken over 200 people. Rangers, scientists, even some hikers who'd wandered in before we could close the trails. Each time it took someone, it grew bigger, stronger, more hungry. One night, while I was looking at the grove through binoculars from our safe zone, I saw something that still gives me nightmares. The biggest tree, the one we called the grandfather tree, had what looked like a mouth opening at its base. Not like a crack or a hole, a real mouth, with teeth made of wooden spikes. And it was smiling. That's when we realized we weren't dealing with a forest anymore. We were dealing with something ancient, something that had been waiting underground for thousands of years, slowly growing, slowly spreading. And now it was fully awake. The government ordered a full quarantine the next day. They put up electric fences and warning signs, but we all knew it wouldn't be enough, because every time we checked the underground scans, the roots had spread further. They were heading toward the city, just 20 miles away. And in the quiet of the night, if you pressed your ear to the ground anywhere within a mile of the forest, you could hear it. The sound of roots growing, of earth being pushed aside, of something huge and hungry slowly reaching out towards civilization. The army showed up in October. They brought tanks, flamethrowers, and enough explosives to level a mountain. I remember thinking, finally, we'll end this. But the forest was ready for them. First, they tried burning it. The flames would catch, but then the trees would release this thick, green mist that put the fires out. It was like the forest had learned from all the wildfires it had survived over the centuries. The soldiers wearing gas masks said the mist smelled sweet, like rotting fruit. We found something you need to see, Colonel Parker told me one morning. He led me to their command tent and showed me pictures taken by their underground radar. The roots weren't just spreading anymore. They were making patterns. Huge circles under the earth, like ritual symbols, all connecting back to the grandfather tree. This thing, the colonel said, it's been here longer than humans. Maybe longer than most life on Earth. And it's farming us. That's when everything clicked. The annual wildlife census, the changing numbers, the forest had been slowly clearing out the animals, making room for bigger prey. Us. It had been planning this for years, maybe centuries. They tried using explosives next. Big mistake. The blast split open the ground, but instead of destroying the roots, it revealed something worse. Under the earth were these huge chambers, like caves made of twisted roots. And in these chambers were cocoons, hundreds of them, made of wood and sap. Inside each one was, I still have nightmares about what was inside. The worst part? Some of the cocoons were empty. Whatever had been growing in them was now out somewhere walking around, maybe even passing for human. One of the younger soldiers found a journal in an old ranger station. It was from 1878, almost 100 years ago. The writer described the same things we were seeing: missing people, moving trees, strange sounds at night. But back then, the forest was smaller, weaker. It had been growing all this time, waiting for the right moment. Late one night, I saw something that made everything even scarier. A deer wandered near the edge of the quarantine zone. A root, thin as a wire, shot up and grabbed it, but instead of pulling it under, the roots seemed to inject something into the deer. The animal stood very still for a moment, then walked straight into the forest on its own, like it had been programmed. The colonel pulled me aside after that. You know what this means? He asked. It's not just hunting anymore. It's learning, adapting. Those roots under the city, they're not just for feeding. They're for controlling. That night, we heard the first reports from the nearby town. People walking into the woods at night like sleepwalkers. Trees growing through concrete where no trees should be able to grow. And worst of all, some people were starting to change, their skin becoming rough and brown, their fingers stretching into something like branches. The forest wasn't just spread by roots anymore. It was spreading through us. I'm writing this from a safe house in Nevada, far from any trees. But even here, I don't feel safe. Not after what I saw in those final days at Redwood. The town nearest to the forest, Miller's Creek, was the first to fall. It started with small things, trees growing in people's backyards overnight, even though nobody had planted them. Kids talking about hearing whispers from the plants in their gardens. Then people began disappearing from their beds at night, leaving behind trails of leaves and twigs. We've lost contact with the east side of town. The police chief told us one morning. Half the town's population, about 3,000 people, had vanished in just 2 weeks. The other half, well, they weren't exactly themselves anymore. I saw one of the changed people up close. It was Mrs. Henderson, who used to run the local diner. Her skin had turned rough and brown, like bark. When she moved, you could hear a sound like rustling leaves. But the scariest part was her eyes. They were completely green, glowing slightly in the dark. She smiled when she saw me, and behind her teeth were tiny, growing leaves. The government tried to keep it quiet, but you can't hide something like this forever, especially when the same things started happening in other cities. Sacramento reported trees growing through the floors of office buildings. In San Francisco, an entire park transformed overnight, the trees twisting into shapes that looked almost human. The scientists who survived discovered something terrifying in their final tests. The forest wasn't just spreading by growing, it was spreading through tiny spores in the air, spores that could travel for miles on the wind, planting seeds of the ancient grove wherever they landed, seeds that would grow into something that looked like a normal tree, until it was ready to change. The official death toll stopped at 245 people, but that's just the number they could confirm. The real number, well, it keeps growing. Every week we hear about new disappearances, new areas where the trees act strange, new reports of people changing. They've blocked off the original forest now, a 50-mile quarantine zone surrounded by electric fences and armed guards. But it's too late. The roots have spread too far, gone too deep. Sometimes, hundreds of miles away, a new growth appears. Always the same kind of trees, always with that same hungry look about them. Last week, I got a letter from Sarah's daughter. You remember Sarah, one of the first rangers to disappear. Her daughter said she's been having strange dreams. Dreams where she can hear her mother's voice calling from inside the trees, telling her to come home to the forest, telling her that the trees have such wonderful things to show her. I didn't write back, because the worst part isn't the forest itself, or even the people it took. The worst part is knowing that this is just the beginning. That ancient thing under the redwoods, that patient, hungry thing that wore the shape of trees. It's finally awake, and it's spreading. Sometimes at night, I look out my window at the small tree growing in my neighbor's yard. It wasn't there last week. And yesterday, I swear I saw one of its branches move, just slightly, even though there wasn't any wind. They say the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. But now I wonder, how many of those trees planted 20 years ago were really trees at all? And how many were just waiting, growing, getting ready? If you're reading this, stay away from the forest, especially the quiet ones, where the birds don't sing and the animals don't go. And if you ever hear trees whispering your name at night, run. Run as far as you can. Because the forest census of 1968 didn't just count the life in those woods. It woke something up, and now it's counting us. I'll never forget my first day working at the Mountain Peak Radio Tower. It was January 1989, and the Rockies were covered in thick snow. The tower stood like a lonely giant against the gray sky, blinking its red warning lights into the clouds. I was young then, just 23, and excited about my new job as a night shift operator. It's mostly weather updates and emergency broadcasts. My supervisor Mike told me during training. He was an older guy with kind eyes and a gray mustache that always needed trimming. Pretty quiet up here. but someone's got to do it. He didn't know how wrong he'd be about the quiet part. The first week was normal enough. I'd arrive at sunset, climb the winding road to the tower, and settle in for my 12-hour shift. The control room was small but cozy, with old coffee-stained mugs and faded photos on the wall from operators who'd worked there before me. The equipment was basic, just our broadcast controls, weather monitoring systems, and the emergency alert setup. But things started feeling different during my second week. It was subtle at first. The signal strength meter would jump for no reason, even when we weren't broadcasting. Late at night, I'd hear strange sounds coming through my headphones. Not static, but something else, like whispers, but not quite words. I mentioned it to Mike during our shift change one morning. He just shrugged it off. Equipment's old, he said. Sometimes it acts up in the cold. Then the calls started coming in, just one or two at first. Listeners saying they were hearing things in our broadcast, voices telling them to do things. We checked the system, but everything seemed normal. Mike said it was probably just people playing pranks. But I knew something was wrong. The whispers in my headphones were getting louder. The signal strength meter kept spiking higher and higher, and every night, more calls came in. People sounding scared, confused, angry. One night, an old woman called crying. She said she could hear her dead husband speaking to her through our station. The really scary part, we weren't even broadcasting at the time. I started keeping a log of everything strange that happened. The signal spikes, the calls, the whispers. Looking back now, I wish I'd done more. Maybe if we'd shut everything down right then, we could have stopped what was coming. But none of us knew. How could we? How could anyone have guessed that our little radio tower was about to become ground zero for something so horrible? The first really bad thing happened on a Tuesday night in late February. I remember because it was snowing heavily and I was alone in the tower. Around midnight, our emergency broadcast system suddenly turned itself on. I hadn't touched anything. It just started blaring that harsh warning tone. I tried to shut it off, but nothing worked. The controls weren't responding. Then the tone changed into something else, something that made my teeth hurt and my head spin. I ripped off my headphones, but I could still hear it coming through the speakers. The phone started ringing nonstop. People from all over the nearby towns were calling, but they weren't making sense. A man from Pine Valley was screaming about how hungry he was, how he could smell his neighbors through the walls. A woman was crying about voices telling her to join the feast. I called Mike at home, my hands shaking as I dialed. Something's really wrong, I told him. People are acting crazy. The system won't shut down. He arrived an hour later, his truck skidding on the icy road. By then, we had reports of violence in 3 different towns. The local police were overwhelmed with calls about people attacking their families, breaking into homes, I can barely write this, trying to eat each other. Mike and I worked frantically to shut down the tower. We even tried cutting the power, but somehow the signal kept broadcasting. The equipment was hot to the touch, humming with energy we couldn't explain. The police chief called us directly around 3 a.m. His voice was shaking. "We've got 23 separate incidents of assault," he said. "People are saying they can't control themselves. They're hearing voices telling them to feed." That's when we noticed something terrifying. The victims of these attacks weren't fighting back. According to the reports coming in, they were just standing there, like they were in a trance. Some were even walking straight toward their attackers, as if being called. The snow kept falling outside, and the signal kept broadcasting. Through our windows, we could see the tower's red lights pulsing in a strange rhythm now, not the steady blink they were supposed to have. The metal at the tower itself seemed to be vibrating. By sunrise, 78 people were dead. Hundreds more were injured. And this was just the beginning. We didn't know it then, but something was using our radio waves, using our tower. It was calling people, gathering them, preparing them for something much worse. The military showed up the next day. Men in hazmat suits with strange equipment. They told us to go home, said they'd handle everything. But I could see the fear in their eyes. They didn't understand what they were dealing with. None of us did. They wouldn't let me go back to the tower, but I could still listen to the signal. Everyone could. Car radios would turn themselves on. Old unplugged radios started working again. The military tried to jam it, but nothing worked. I stayed at my sister's house in town, watching through her kitchen window as more military trucks rolled in. The streets were empty now. Everyone was too scared to go out. We could hear screaming at night, getting closer each time. The news tried to cover what was happening, but reporters kept changing. Right in the middle of broadcasts, they'd stop talking and just stare at the camera, drooling, their eyes all glassy. Then they'd start talking about how hungry they were, how everyone needed to join together. My sister Sarah noticed it first. The people who'd been attacked but survived, they were different. They'd stand in their yards at night, all facing the tower. Sometimes they'd walk toward it, like sleepwalkers. The police tried stopping them, but there were too many. I called Mike every day until he stopped answering. When I drove by his house, I saw his truck in the driveway, driver's door open, radio blasting that awful signal. There was a trail of footprints in the mud leading away from his house toward the tower. The military set up roadblocks, but it didn't help. People were climbing through windows, crawling through sewers, doing anything to get closer to the tower. And the ones they caught, they weren't human anymore. Not really. Their skin was gray, and they moved wrong, like puppets on strings. One soldier told me in secret what they found. The signal wasn't just making people crazy, it was changing them. Their bodies were different inside, and when they died, they didn't stay still. They would twitch and move toward each other, like magnets pulling together. The death count kept rising. 892 people now. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was watching the bodies. They were all being drawn to the same place, the base of the tower. And they were connecting somehow, growing together into something else. Sarah and I packed our car to leave town, but when we turned the key, the radio came on full blast. The signal was different now, deeper, hungrier. Through the static, we could hear voices we recognized. Mom's voice, Dad's voice. They've been dead for years. Come join us, they said. We're all going to be together soon. One big family, one big body. That's when we saw it. The thing at the tower was getting bigger. All those bodies joining together, reaching up the metal beams like a giant hand made of people. And the signal just kept getting stronger. Something was coming through, something that had been waiting, calling, gathering us all together. And now it was almost here. The day everything fell apart started with silence. For the first time in weeks, the signal stopped. Everyone thought it was over. We were wrong. It was just gathering strength. Sarah and I were in our basement with other survivors when we heard the explosion. The whole ground shook. When we looked out the tiny window, we saw that the military had tried blowing up the tower. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then we heard it, a sound no human throat could make. It came from the tower, or what was left of it. The thing that had been growing there, that mass of bodies all joined together. It was moving, standing up. Don't look at it, someone screamed. But we couldn't help ourselves. Through the basement window, we could see it rising against the sunset. It was huge, like a mountain made of people. All those faces we knew, our neighbors, friends, family, were still there, still moving, still whispering. The military started shooting, but bullets just sank into it like they were hitting mud. Tanks fired, and the holes they made just filled back in with more bodies. The thing kept growing, pulling in anyone who got too close. I saw Mike in there, his face pressed against the surface like he was underwater. His eyes were open, and his mouth was moving. The radio in our basement clicked on by itself, and we heard his voice. It's beautiful in here. We're all together now. No more being alone. The soldiers started falling one by one, not from attacks. They just stopped, dropped their weapons, and walked toward the thing with empty eyes. The signal was in their heads too. Nobody could fight it. Sarah grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. Listen, she whispered, through the radio static, through all the voices calling us to join. There was something else, something older than words, older than people. It was speaking through all those joined together mouths, using our dead friends like a giant puppet. I have waited, it said. In the spaces between your signals, in the quiet between stations. Now I am here. Now we will all be one. The thing at the tower was changing shape. All those bodies were melting together, forming something new, something that shouldn't exist. It reached up with arms made of countless humans, touching the sky, pulling itself higher. That's when the jets came. We could hear them before we saw them. The military's last resort, they were going to bomb everything. Sarah and I held each other, waiting for the end. But even as the bombs fell, even as fire lit up the sky, we could still hear the signal. Still hear those voices calling. The thing at the tower wasn't stopping. It wasn't dying. It was spreading. That was 35 years ago. Sometimes I think about how many people don't know what really happened. The government covered it up, called it a mass hysteria event. They rebuilt the towns, planted new trees, tried to make everyone forget. But the signal is still out there. Sarah and I were among the few survivors who made it out that night. The bombs destroyed most of the thing at the tower, scattered those joined bodies across the mountains. But they never found all the pieces, and they never truly stopped the broadcast. Late at night, if you drive through those mountains with an old radio, you can still catch it. A whisper between stations, a voice calling out to anyone who'll listen. The military keeps the area blocked off, says it's for environmental research. But I know the truth. They're still finding bodies, still finding pieces that move on their own, trying to join back together. I live in Florida now, as far from the mountains as I could get. But sometimes my radio turns on by itself at night. I hear Mike's voice or my parents telling me it's not too late to join them. The thing that came through our tower, it's patient. It can wait. Last month, I got a letter from another survivor. She's been tracking weird incidents across the country. Cases of cannibalism, mass disappearances, people walking away from their lives towards something only they can hear. Always near old radio towers. Always with the same pattern. The really scary part, the numbers are growing. More towers, more signals, more voices calling in the night. That thing we helped bring through, it's not finished. It's learning, spreading, using our own technology against us. Every broadcast, every signal, every wave in the air could be carrying its voice. I tried warning people at first, but who believes such a crazy story? So I wrote it all down instead, everything that happened at Mountain Peak Radio Tower. Maybe someone will read this and understand. Maybe they'll know what to do when they hear those voices calling, when their radio turns on in the middle of the night. Because it's still out there, still hungry, still growing. And it's not just in the mountains anymore. It's in the air around us, in every signal, in every broadcast. Waiting, calling, gathering. Sometimes at night, I look at my radio and wonder, how many more towers? How many more voices? How long until it's strong enough to try again? And sometimes in my darkest moments, I wonder if it's already too late. If we're all just waiting to become part of something bigger, something that's been patient for so long, using our own voices to call us home. So if you're reading this and your radio starts acting strange, if you hear voices you know couldn't be there, don't listen. Don't answer. Just run. Because the signal never really stopped, and it's still getting stronger. I never thought I'd be writing this down, but people need to know what happened at the Arctic Research Station back in 1995. My name is Dr. Mike Collins, and I was the lead biologist there. Sometimes late at night, I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about those 3 terrible weeks in Alaska. Our research station wasn't anything fancy, just a cluster of buildings nestled between snow-covered mountains about 200 miles from the nearest town. There were 234 of us there, all scientists and support staff, studying climate change and its effects on the permafrost. It was important work, we thought. Little did we know we were about to uncover something that should have stayed frozen forever. I remember the day I first arrived. The helicopter dropped me off along with 5 other researchers. Sarah Chen, our geology expert, pointed out the main building, a 2-story structure with small windows that looked like they were fighting against the constant snow. Next to it was our lab complex, where we spent most of our time drilling ice cores and analyzing samples. Everything seemed normal at first. We'd wake up, grab breakfast in the common room, the coffee was always terrible, and head to our labs. The support staff kept everything running: electricity, heating, communications. Outside, it was a frozen wasteland as far as the eye could see. The sun would barely show up during winter, leaving us in what felt like endless darkness. Our team was like a small family. Dr. James Peterson, my old friend from grad school, ran the drilling operations. Emma Torres handled our communications and weather monitoring. We even had movie nights every Friday, squeezing into the recreation room with hot chocolate and stale popcorn. But then we started the deep drilling project. We were supposed to be studying ancient climate patterns in the ice cores. Instead, we found something else, something that had been waiting in the dark for millions of years. I should have noticed the warning signs, the strange readings from our instruments, the way some of the ice cores seemed to pulse. But we were too excited about our discovery, too eager to make history. We didn't realize we were about to become part of a very different kind of history. It started on a Tuesday. I remember because we were all complaining about having fish for lunch again. We had just pulled up a new ice core from about 3 miles deep, and something was different about this one. Instead of the usual clear ice, there were these tiny dark spots scattered throughout. "Mike, you need to see this." Sarah called me over to her microscope. What I saw made my stomach turn. The dark spots were moving. Tiny organisms, smaller than a grain of sand, swimming in the melted ice water. It looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. Not bacteria, not viruses, but something in between. James was the first to get sick. He'd been handling the ice core samples all morning. At dinner, he complained about feeling itchy, like bugs crawling under my skin, he said, scratching his arms. We sent him to the medical bay, thinking it was just an allergic reaction. Dr. Wilson, our chief medical officer, gave him some antihistamines and told him to get some rest. The next morning, things got worse. James's skin had turned gray, and he was burning with fever. But the scariest part, he could tell us exactly what was happening to him. "I can feel them moving inside me," he kept saying. They're eating me, Mike, but they're keeping me awake to feel it all." We tried to quarantine him, but it was already too late. By lunchtime, 3 more researchers who had worked with the ice core showed the same symptoms. The tiny organisms were spreading, and they were smart about it. They didn't kill their hosts right away. They kept them alive and conscious, using them like puppets to move around and infect others. I called an emergency meeting in the main hall. "Nobody leaves their rooms without protective gear," I ordered, but panic was already setting in. Some wanted to call for immediate evacuation. Others worried about the organisms spreading beyond the station. Emma tried to radio for help, but a blizzard was interfering with our communications. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside my window, and somewhere in the station, I could hear screaming. Not screams of pain. Those would have been easier to handle. These were screams of pure terror from people watching their own bodies being taken over by something they couldn't fight. Dr. Wilson came to my room at dawn, his face pale. "Mike," he whispered, "you need to see what's happening to James and the others. They're starting to change. And I think they're trying to find each other." I grabbed my protective suit and followed him to the medical bay. Nothing in my 20 years of biology research could have prepared me for what I was about to see. The medical bay doors were frozen shut, literally covered in ice from the inside. When we finally broke through, the temperature inside was below freezing. James and the other infected researchers were huddled in the corner, their bodies twisted in ways that weren't natural. Their skin had turned almost transparent, like frozen glass, and I could see dark shapes moving underneath. "Help us, Mike," James said in a voice that wasn't quite his anymore. "We're so cold. We need to find more warmth." He took a step toward us, and I noticed how his feet left wet footprints, not from water, but from his own melting flesh. Dr. Wilson grabbed my arm. "We need to seal this wing off. Now." We barely made it out before the infected people started running, faster than they should have been able to move. We locked every door between them and the main station, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't hold them for long. The next few days were a nightmare. More people got infected, despite our best efforts. The parasites were spreading through the ventilation system, through the water pipes, even through the walls themselves. They seemed to thrive in the cold, using it to preserve their hosts while they changed them. Emma finally got through to the mainland on our backup radio. "This is Arctic Research Station calling for emergency evacuation," she said, her voice shaking. "We have a severe biological contamination. I repeat, we need immediate." She never finished that sentence. Something crashed through the ceiling above her. I pulled her away just in time, but I'll never forget what I saw. It looked like a person, but stretched and twisted, with ice crystals growing from their skin. A rescue team arrived 2 days later, 15 brave men and women in hazmat suits. We tried to warn them to stay away, but they wouldn't listen. They wanted to help. Within hours, they were all infected. The parasites seemed to learn from each new host they took, getting smarter, stronger. The worst part was watching it happen to Sarah. She was helping me barricade the lab doors when she suddenly stopped. "Mike," she whispered, "I can feel them. In my blood, in my brain. They're not just eating us. They're learning from us, and they want us to join together." "Join together?" I asked, backing away from her. "What do you mean?" Her eyes had turned milky white with frost when she answered. "They want us to become one, something bigger, something that can survive the warmth, and they want to reach the city." That's when we heard it, a sound like cracking ice and breaking bones, coming from the direction of the medical bay. The infected weren't just changing anymore. They were combining, and whatever they were becoming, it was big enough to shake the whole station. I ran to my office and sent one final message to the military command. The infection is beyond containment. The organisms are combining hosts into a larger entity. If it reaches any populated area, I didn't need to finish. They knew what had to be done. What happened next still haunts my dreams. The walls between the medical bay and the main building began to crack. Not from the cold, from something pushing through them. When it finally broke through, I understood what Sarah meant about becoming one. It was like looking at a nightmare made of ice and flesh. All the infected people, my friends, the rescue team, they had somehow melted together into one massive creature. I could still see their faces frozen in the ice-like skin, their eyes moving, watching. James's face was near what looked like a head, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to speak. The thing was huge, filling up entire hallways. It moved like a wave of ice and meat, crushing everything in its path. The parasites had taken all the knowledge from their hosts. They knew how to open doors, how to use tools, how to think. And now they were using that knowledge to try to escape. Emma, one of the few still not infected, grabbed my arm. "The temperature controls," she said. "Maybe we can make it too hot for them." We ran to the control room, but the creature was learning fast. It had already frozen the heating system solid. The few of us left tried to stay together. We hid in the kitchen storage room, pushing heavy freezers against the doors. Through the small window, we could see the creature growing bigger, absorbing anyone it caught. It was getting smarter too, figuring out how to use the station's computers, trying to access our vehicles. "Look," Dr. Wilson pointed at the window. The creature was heading toward the garage where we kept the snowmobiles. That's when we realized it wasn't just trying to catch us anymore. It was trying to find a way to reach the nearest town. I grabbed our emergency radio. The organism is mobile and growing. It's attempting to leave the station. If it reaches any populated area, the infection will spread beyond control. My hands were shaking as I spoke. I repeat, the creature is trying to escape. It can survive in the cold, and it's still absorbing people. The radio crackled with a response. "Understood, Dr. Collins. Military units are en route, but we need you to get as many survivors as possible to the underground storage bunker." "Why?" I asked, but deep down, I already knew the answer. There was a long pause before they responded. "Because in 3 hours, we're going to have to destroy the entire station. It's the only way to be sure." The creature must have heard us somehow. It started pounding against the kitchen walls, making the whole room shake. Through the ice-covered window, I could see Sarah's face in its surface, her expression frozen in a silent scream. And behind her, hundreds of dark shapes were swimming, looking for new hosts to add to their growing nightmare. We had 3 hours to get to the bunker, but between us and safety was a monster made from my friends and colleagues, all of them still conscious, all of them still aware of what they had become. And it was getting bigger by the minute. Time was running out. There were only 12 of us left uninfected, and we had to cross the entire station to reach the underground bunker. Emma figured out a plan. We'd use the maintenance tunnels under the floor. They were tight, but the creature might be too big to follow us. "We'll go in groups of 3, I whispered. "Stay quiet, and if anyone shows any signs of infection, you have to leave them behind." The words felt like acid in my mouth. but we all knew it was our only chance. The first group made it through okay. The second group too. I was in the last group with Emma and Dr. Wilson. Just as we were about to enter the tunnel, we heard a sound that made my blood freeze. The creature had figured out where we were going. It wasn't just following us through the station anymore. It was breaking through the floors to reach the tunnels. "Run!" I shouted, no longer caring about being quiet. We crawled through those narrow tunnels as fast as we could. Behind us, I could hear the walls cracking, pipes bursting. The creature was learning, adapting. It was breaking itself into smaller pieces to follow us. Halfway through, Dr. Wilson stopped. "My leg," he said, rolling up his pants. There was a small dark spot on his ankle, like a bruise. But we could see it spreading, turning his skin gray. "Go," he said, pushing us away. "I'll try to slow it down." We didn't want to leave him, but we had no choice. As we crawled away, I heard him talking to the creature. "Come on, you want to learn about human biology? Let me teach you." His voice changed into something else before he finished speaking. Emma and I finally reached the bunker. 8 others had made it. Behind us, we could hear the creature getting closer. It was talking now, using the voices of everyone it had absorbed. "Mike, Emma, let us show you what we've learned." The military radioed again. 30 minutes to strike. Is everyone in position? I looked at our small group, doing a final check for infections. Then I noticed something terrible, frost forming on the bunker walls. The creature wasn't just coming for us anymore. It had split into dozens of smaller pieces, surrounding the bunker, trying to freeze us out. "We can't let it keep us here," Emma said, checking her watch. "If we're above ground when the strike hits," she didn't need to finish. We all knew what that meant. The creature kept talking with our friends' voices. "The cold is our home now. Join us, and we'll survive together." Ice crystals were forming on the bunker door. We could see faces in the frost. James, Sarah, Dr. Wilson, all of them watching us waiting. 20 minutes left. The bunker walls were cracking from the cold. Above us, we could hear military jets approaching. And somewhere in the station, something massive was still growing, still learning, still trying to find a way to reach civilization. All we could do was wait, hoping the bunker would protect us from both the creature and what was coming to destroy it. Through the bunker's small window, I saw something enormous moving across the snow, heading toward the distant lights of the nearest town. We were out of time. The military's last message was simple: close your eyes, cover your ears, and pray we're not too late. Even in our underground bunker, the explosion was devastating. The whole world turned white, then dark. The noise was like nothing I'd ever heard before. It felt like the mountains themselves were breaking apart. We huddled together in that small space, holding onto each other, praying the bunker would hold. When everything finally got quiet, we waited another hour before trying to contact anyone. The military's voice crackled through our radio. "Survivors, please respond." 9 of us answered. The 10th person hadn't made it. The cold had reached him just before the strike. They picked us up by helicopter the next morning. Where our research station had been, there was nothing but a massive crater filled with blackened ice. The creature was gone. At least, that's what we thought at first. As we flew away, I looked down and saw something that made my heart stop. Deep in the crater, in the chunks of ice that had melted, there were tiny dark spots. Moving spots. The parasites had survived, buried deep in the permafrost waiting. The military quarantined us for 6 months. They ran every test they could think of to make sure we weren't infected. They asked us thousands of questions, made us tell the story over and over. But in the end, they classified everything. The world would never know what really happened at that station. Emma quit science altogether. Last I heard, she moved to Hawaii, somewhere warm, she said. Somewhere nothing could survive in the ice. Most of the others who survived never spoke to each other again. The memories were too painful. I still work in biology, but not in the Arctic. Never again in the Arctic. Sometimes, when I'm in my lab, I think about those ice cores, about the things we found that should have stayed frozen, about my friends still conscious while they were transformed into that thing, about how close we came to letting it reach civilization. Last week, I got a letter from the military. Global warming is causing the permafrost to melt faster than ever. They're seeing strange readings from the crash site, dark spots in the ice, movement. They want me to come back. They say I'm the only one who really knows what to look for, that I could help prevent it from happening again. I burned the letter. But every night, I watch the news about climate change, about the ice caps melting, about things being found in the permafrost. And I wonder, what else is frozen up there waiting to wake up? What other ancient horrors are we about to uncover? And sometimes on cold nights, I swear I can feel something moving under my skin. The doctors say it's just my imagination, just trauma from what I saw. They say I'm not infected, that I'm safe. But is anyone really safe? After all, the ice is melting, and those things, they're patient. They waited millions of years to be found once. They can wait a little longer to be found again. I'll never forget that spring morning at the Grand Canyon when we found something that should have stayed buried forever. I was just a junior geologist back then, fresh out of college and excited about my first big project. Our team was doing what seemed like a routine survey, checking the canyon walls for any unusual formations or possible cave systems. "Hey Sarah, come take a look at this." Tom, our lead researcher, called out to me. He was standing near a strange-looking crack in the canyon wall, about 50 feet down from the rim. Using our safety ropes, I climbed down to where he was. The moment I got close, I knew something was different. The rock felt weird under my hands, not like normal canyon rock at all. It was smoother, almost polished, with these odd hexagonal patterns running through it. Our instruments were going crazy too. The readings we were getting made no sense. They showed hollow spaces behind the rock wall that seemed to go on forever. "We need to get a closer look," I said, already reaching for my rock hammer. Looking back now, I wish I had just climbed back up and never touched that wall. But how could I have known? We were all so excited about what we thought was going to be an amazing scientific discovery. We spent the next 3 days carefully drilling small holes and sending in cameras. What we saw was incredible, a massive cave system, but the walls weren't natural. They looked like they were carved, with thousands of perfect hexagonal cells, like some giant honeycomb. We found some strange fossils too, things none of us had ever seen before. They looked like huge insects, bigger than my hand, perfectly preserved in the rock. That's when Dr. Chen, our paleontologist, made the mistake that would cost hundreds of lives. She decided to take some samples back to our lab near the visitor center. "These fossils might be millions of years old," she said excitedly. "This could be the discovery of the century." None of us realized those weren't fossils. They were eggs, and they were still alive. It started on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in the lab. I was looking through my microscope at one of the fossil samples when I noticed something odd. It was moving. Just a tiny twitch at first, like when you think you see something move out of the corner of your eye. I thought I was just tired from working too long. But then I heard Dr. Chen scream from across the room. The samples we'd brought back, all 50 of them, were cracking open. Inside each one was something that looked like a cross between a wasp and a beetle, about the size of my palm. Their shells were a dark metallic blue, and they had these strange, almost glowing eyes. Before we could do anything, they burst out of their cases and flew straight up to the ceiling. Nobody moved. Dr. Chen whispered, but it was too late. One of our interns panicked and ran for the door. The insects, all of them, turned their heads at once, like they were one thing instead of 50 separate creatures. That's when we first realized they weren't just acting on instinct. They were thinking, together. The attack was so fast I barely saw it happen. The swarm descended on the intern before he could reach the door. We heard his screams, and then silence. When they flew away from him, he was still breathing, but there were these small, dark marks all over his skin, like tiny injections. Tom managed to hit the emergency lockdown button, trapping the swarm in the lab with us, and probably saving thousands of lives in the process. We hid under the steel tables, watching in horror as the creatures started working together, building something in the corner of the room that looked like a smaller version of the hive we found. Using our phones, we managed to call for help, but by then the intern started convulsing. His skin began to bulge in places like something was moving underneath. Dr. Chen tried to help him, but when she got close, we all saw it. dozens of tiny shapes moving under his skin. He wasn't just stung, he was being used as a nest. The military arrived within an hour, but by then, the swarm had already broken through the lab's ventilation system. They were loose in the Grand Canyon, and they were heading back to their original hive. Even worse, we could see more eggs starting to crack open in the cave system we discovered. This was just the beginning of the nightmare. The next few days were like a horrible dream that wouldn't end. The park rangers tried to evacuate everyone, but there were thousands of tourists spread across the canyon. Many of them were hiking deep in the trails or camping in remote spots where phone signals couldn't reach. I was in the emergency command center when the first reports started coming in. A group of hikers had been attacked near Bright Angel Trail, then another group at Desert View. Soon, our emergency radio couldn't keep up with all the distress calls. They're so fast, one ranger reported, his voice shaking. They move like one big cloud, but they can split up and attack from different directions. It's like they're talking to each other somehow. The worst part was what happened to the people who got stung. Within hours, they would collapse, unable to move. Their skin would turn gray, and then, I still have nightmares about what happened next. Each victim became a living nest, just like our intern. The insects would burst out of them after a few hours, adding to the swarm's numbers. We tried everything we could think of. Bug spray didn't work. Smoke just made them angry. Even when military helicopters came with special insect-killing chemicals, the swarm seemed to know exactly how to avoid them. They would hide in caves or split into smaller groups, then come back together later. But the scariest moment came when we realized they were learning. They started cutting off escape routes, trapping people in certain areas. They would wait near water sources, knowing people would have to come there eventually. Some of them even figured out how to open simple door latches. One evening, I saw something that still haunts me. The swarm gathered above the canyon, thousands of them now, moving together in the sunset. Suddenly, they started forming a shape in the sky. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but others saw it too. The swarm was forming into something that looked like a giant human figure, floating above the canyon. That's when we knew this wasn't just about survival for them. They weren't just hunting. They were thinking, planning, maybe even trying to communicate in their own terrifying way. They're evolving, Dr. Chen said, her voice barely a whisper. Every time they use a human host to reproduce, they get smarter. They're learning from us. By the end of the week, the death toll was climbing. 567 tourists and 89 park staff were either dead or missing. The entire Grand Canyon National Park had become a no-go zone. But the worst part, we could see more eggs starting to hatch in the original hive. Thousands more. We needed a solution, and we needed it fast. That's when someone suggested a desperate plan, one that would change the canyon forever. It was Tom who came up with the plan. Water, he said during an emergency meeting. These insects survived millions of years because they were sealed in dry rock. Maybe that's their weakness. The idea was dangerous but simple. We would flood part of the canyon. The Glen Canyon Dam was upstream, and if we released enough water at once, it would fill up all the caves and hopefully drown the swarm. The problem was, this could also destroy years of research, archaeological sites, and change the canyon's shape forever. But we were running out of options. The swarm was getting bigger and smarter every day. That morning, they had formed into their human shape again, and this time, they actually walked across the canyon rim like a giant made of buzzing insects. People who saw it said it looked like it was searching for something. The military brought in experts to help plan the flood. I worked with them, showing them maps of all the cave systems we knew about. While we worked, we could hear the constant sound of helicopters and emergency sirens. The swarm had begun attacking nearby towns. How long will it take? I asked the dam operator. 6 hours to get enough water built up, he said. Then about 30 minutes for it to reach the target area. But this has never been done before. We don't know exactly what will happen. We set the plan for dawn the next day. That night was the longest of my life. The swarm seemed to sense something was coming. They gathered in huge numbers above the canyon, their wings making a sound like 1,000 whispers. The human shape appeared again, bigger than ever, and this time it seemed to be pointing at the dam. They know, Dr. Chen said, watching through binoculars. Somehow, they know what we're planning. Just before sunrise, they attacked the dam. Thousands of them swarmed the control room trying to get in. The soldiers used special electrical nets to keep them back while the dam operators worked. I was inside, helping coordinate with the team in the canyon. At exactly 6:00 a.m., we opened the floodgates. The noise was like thunder as millions of gallons of water rushed down the canyon. We all watched, hoping our plan would work, praying we hadn't just made things worse. The water hit the target area like a liquid bulldozer. It filled every crack, every cave, every hidden space. The swarm tried to escape, forming their human shape one last time. But this time, it looked different. It looked like it was screaming. Then the water took them. They're so fast. One ranger reported, his voice shaking. They move like one big cloud, but they can split up and attack from different directions. It's like they're talking to each other somehow. The worst part was what happened to the people who got stung. Within hours, they would collapse, unable to move. Their skin would turn gray, and then, I still have nightmares about what happened next. Each victim became a living nest, just like our intern. The insects would burst out of them after a few hours, adding to the swarm's numbers. We tried everything we could think of. Bug spray didn't work. Smoke just made them angry. Even when military helicopters came with special insect-killing chemicals, the swarm seemed to know exactly how to avoid them. They would hide in caves or split into smaller groups, then come back together later. But the scariest moment came when we realized they were learning. They started cutting off escape routes, trapping people in certain areas. They would wait near water sources, knowing people would have to come there eventually. Some of them even figured out how to open simple door latches. One evening, I saw something that still haunts me. The swarm gathered above the canyon, thousands of them now, moving together in the sunset. Suddenly, they started forming a shape in the sky. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but others saw it too. The swarm was forming into something that looked like a giant human figure, floating above the canyon. That's when we knew this wasn't just about survival for them. They weren't just hunting. They were thinking, planning, maybe even trying to communicate in their own terrifying way. They're evolving, Dr. Chen said, her voice barely a whisper. Every time they use a human host to reproduce, they get smarter. They're learning from us. By the end of the week, the death toll was climbing. 567 tourists and 89 park staff were either dead or missing. The entire Grand Canyon National Park had become a no-go zone. But the worst part, we could see more eggs starting to hatch in the original hive. Thousands more. We needed a solution, and we needed it fast. That's when someone suggested a desperate plan, one that would change the canyon forever. It was Tom who came up with the plan. Water. He said during an emergency meeting, these insects survived millions of years because they were sealed in dry rock. Maybe that's their weakness. The idea was dangerous but simple. We would flood part of the canyon. The Glen Canyon Dam was upstream, and if we released enough water at once, it would fill up all the caves and hopefully drown the swarm. The problem was, this could also destroy years of research, archaeological sites, and change the canyon's shape forever. But we were running out of options. The swarm was getting bigger and smarter every day. That morning, they had formed into their human shape again. And this time, they actually walked across the canyon rim, like a giant made of buzzing insects. People who saw it said it looked like it was searching for something. The military brought in experts to help plan the flood. I worked with them, showing them maps of all the cave systems we knew about. While we worked, we could hear the constant sound of helicopters and emergency sirens. The swarm had begun attacking nearby towns. How long will it take? I asked the dam operator. 6 hours to get enough water built up, he said. Then about 30 minutes for it to reach the target area. But this has never been done before. We don't know exactly what will happen. We set the plan for dawn the next day. That night was the longest of my life. The swarm seemed to sense something was coming. They gathered in huge numbers above the canyon, their wings making a sound like 1,000 whispers. The human shape appeared again, bigger than ever, and this time it seemed to be pointing at the dam. They know, Dr. Chen said, watching through binoculars. Somehow, they know what we're planning. Just before sunrise, they attacked the dam. Thousands of them swarmed the control room, trying to get in. The soldiers used special electrical nets to keep them back while the dam operators worked. I was inside, helping coordinate with the team in the canyon. At exactly 6:00 a.m., we opened the floodgates. The noise was like thunder as millions of gallons of water rushed down the canyon. We all watched, hoping our plan would work, praying we hadn't just made things worse. The water hit the target area like a liquid bulldozer. It filled every crack, every cave, every hidden space. The swarm tried to escape, forming their human shape one last time. But this time it looked different. It looked like it was screaming. Then the water took them. I never thought I'd be the one to uncover something this terrible. My name is Mike Anderson, and I was just a regular cave researcher at Mammoth Cave National Park in Kentucky. Everything changed that warm morning in June 2010. I was leading a routine survey with my team when Sarah, one of our newer researchers, noticed a crack in the wall that wasn't on any of our maps. It was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but when we shined our lights inside, we could see it open into something much bigger. Mike, this wasn't here during last month's survey, was it? Sarah asked, her headlamp illuminating the strange crack. No, I replied, checking our old maps again. This is completely new. Maybe from that small earthquake we had 2 weeks ago. We decided to take a closer look. After about 20 minutes of careful squeezing through the narrow passage, the space suddenly opened up into a massive chamber. Our lights couldn't even reach the ceiling or the far walls. The air felt different here, cooler and somehow wrong. There was a smell I'd never encountered before in all my years of caving, something like wet soil mixed with copper. What really caught our attention were the marks on the walls. At first, we thought they were just natural formations, but as we got closer, we realized they were carvings, hundreds of them. Some looked ancient, others seemed newer, but they all showed the same strange patterns that none of us had ever seen before. We spent hours taking photos and measurements. This discovery was huge. We just found what could be the largest unexplored cave system in North America. Within days, news of our findings spread through the caving community. Everyone wanted to be part of the exploration. If only we'd sealed that crack right then. If only we'd noticed the warning signs, the strange echoes that didn't sound quite right, the way our equipment kept malfunctioning, or how our phones would suddenly lose signal even in areas where they usually worked fine. But we were too excited about the discovery to see what was right in front of us, and that excitement would soon turn into our worst nightmare. Within a week of our discovery, spelunking groups from all over the country came to explore the new tunnels. At first, everything seemed normal, just regular cave exploration, but then people started going missing. It began with a group of 3 experienced cavers. They were supposed to return after a 6-hour expedition, but they never came back. I was in charge of the search team. Their last check-in was at point B7, I told the rescue team, pointing at our new map. They reported finding some kind of large chamber. Then the radio went silent. We searched for 48 hours straight, but found nothing, not even their equipment. It was like they'd vanished into thin air. Before we could even process this, another group disappeared, then another, and another. By the end of the week, 156 people had gone missing. I couldn't sleep at night, knowing they were somewhere down there. The park officials tried to keep things quiet to avoid panic, but word got out. Local news vans started showing up at the park entrance. Mike, you need to see this, Sarah called me one evening. She'd been reviewing footage from a camera we placed near the entrance of the new section. The video showed something that made my blood run cold, a shadow moving in ways that didn't look human at all. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and moved like it knew exactly where it was going, even in complete darkness. We also started finding strange things, shredded backpacks, broken helmets, and most disturbing of all, claw marks on the cave walls that weren't there before. They were fresh, deep gouges in solid rock. The most chilling moment came when we heard voices calling for help through our radio one night. We recognized them. They belonged to the first group that had disappeared, but they'd been missing for 5 days by then. How could they still be alive down there without food or water? Please, someone, they're hunting us. The voice crackled through our radio, then went dead silent. The police were involved now, but they were just as confused as we were. How do you search for missing people in a cave system that seems to go on forever? And worse, how do you explain the strange sounds we kept hearing? Sounds that seemed to be getting closer to the main tourist areas of the cave. That's when we realized this wasn't just about missing people anymore. Something was down there, something that had been waiting for us to find it. What we discovered next changed everything. I was part of a special team sent deeper into the cave system, along with some military experts. We had better equipment this time: night vision goggles, motion sensors, and weapons. None of us wanted to think we'd need the guns, but after what happened to those 156 people, we couldn't take chances. "Movement ahead," whispered Jones, one of the military guys, as we entered a massive chamber. Our lights revealed something impossible: buildings. Yes, actual structures carved into the cave walls that looked ancient but somehow lived in. Then we saw them. They were human, or at least they had been once. Pale white skin that almost glowed in our lights. Eyes so big they took up most of their faces. Completely black, like a shark's. They moved on all fours sometimes, but could stand up straight, taller than any normal person. "Those marks on their clothes," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. They're from different decades. Look at that one. That's a 1950s dress." She was right. These creatures were wearing torn, rotted pieces of clothing from different time periods. That's when it hit us. All those missing persons reports over the years, all those unsolved disappearances in the area. These were those people, or rather, what they'd become. We found journals too, left behind by some of the early victims. They told a horrible story. People who got lost in the caves didn't all die. Some survived, had children, and over many generations, they changed. Their bodies adapted to life in complete darkness. They evolved into perfect cave hunters. But the worst part? They weren't just surviving down here. They were organized. They had their own society, their own language, strange clicking sounds that echoed through the tunnels. And now that we'd opened up their home, they were expanding their hunting grounds. Through hand signals, we started to back away slowly. But one of our lights caught a face in the darkness, one of the missing spelunkers from last week. He was still normal looking, but his eyes were already starting to change. "Help us," he whispered. "They're changing us. They put something in our food, our water. I can feel myself changing too." Before we could reach him, they took him back into the darkness. His screams echoed through the tunnels, mixing with those clicking sounds that now seemed to come from every direction. We barely made it back to report what we found, but by then it was already too late. The hunters had started moving through the smaller tunnels, finding new ways out, and they were hungry. The next 3 months were like a nightmare that wouldn't end. The creatures started getting bolder, coming out through smaller cave openings we didn't even know existed. At first, they stuck to taking animals, pets that got too close to cave entrances, livestock from nearby farms. But then they got braver. The first human attacks happened in the small towns near Mammoth Cave. People started going missing from their homes at night. The police found strange scratch marks on windowsills and weird footprints that looked human, but not quite right. Over 1,200 people gone in just 3 months, I heard the police chief say during an emergency meeting. And those are just the ones we know about. The government tried to keep it quiet at first. They said it was a series of bear attacks, then blamed it on escaped zoo animals. But you can't hide something like this forever, especially when people started catching glimpses of the creatures on their security cameras. I remember one particularly bad night. I was staying late at the research center when Sarah burst in, pale as a ghost. "Mike, they found a way into the town's water treatment plant," she said, hands shaking as she showed me the footage. "They're using the old drainage tunnels to move around." The video showed dozens of them crawling through the pipes, those pale, twisted bodies moving like spiders through the underground system. They were spreading much faster than anyone expected. What made it worse was that we couldn't just kill them. DNA tests proved they were still technically human, evolved and changed, but human. Some were the great-great-grandchildren of people who'd gone missing in these caves as far back as the 1800s. But they weren't interested in making peace. Every attempt to communicate ended in violence. They saw us as food, nothing more, and they were smart. They could use simple tools, set traps, and even figured out how to cut power lines to make areas darker for their hunts. The town started putting up floodlights everywhere. People weren't allowed out after dark. Kids couldn't play outside anymore. Everyone kept their windows locked, even during the hot summer days. But the lights didn't stop them. They just made them more careful, more selective in their hunting. And all the while, their numbers kept growing. Every person they took was another potential hunter in the making if they decided to keep them alive. The government finally had to admit this was more than they could handle. That's when they called in the military. But none of us were ready for what would happen next. The army arrived in full force one cold morning in September. I'd never seen anything like it. Tanks, helicopters, and hundreds of soldiers setting up camp around Mammoth Cave. They had special gear designed for underground combat. Night vision goggles, heat sensors, and weapons with infrared sights. We're going in at dawn. Colonel Richards told us during the briefing. We'll clear them out, section by section. But the creatures were ready for them. They knew every tunnel, every crack in the rocks. They'd had generations to learn the cave system, and they used that knowledge well. The first team went in at 6 a.m. I was in the command center, watching through their body cameras. Everything seemed quiet at first. Then the screens started going dark, one by one. We could hear screaming through the radio, then that horrible clicking sound. They're in the walls. One soldier yelled before his camera went dead. They're coming through thee. The next 3 days were pure chaos. The creatures had dug hundreds of small tunnels we didn't know about. They'd pop up behind the soldiers, drag them into dark holes, then disappear. The army's heavy weapons were useless in the narrow caves. The noise and vibrations just caused cave-ins that trapped our own people. What scared me most was how organized they were. They weren't just animals acting on instinct. They had tactics. They set ambushes. They even used our own equipment against us after taking it from fallen soldiers. Sir, a young lieutenant radioed in. We found their main nest, but there are children down here. Hundreds of them. Some look almost normal, others. His voice trailed off. That's what made it so hard. These weren't just monsters. They were families. Twisted, changed families, but families nonetheless. Some of the younger ones could have passed for regular kids. Just really pale ones. Until you saw their eyes or how they moved. The battle went on for days. The army managed to seal off many of the tunnels, but at a heavy cost. We lost over 200 soldiers. The creatures lost many more, but they kept fighting, protecting their home. Finally, Colonel Richards made a difficult decision. We can't beat them down here, he said. This is their world. We need to seal them in. All of it. The military brought in huge machines to seal every known entrance to Mammoth Cave. They poured concrete into tunnels, welded steel plates over openings, and set up motion sensors everywhere. The official story. A toxic gas leak made the cave system unsafe. The park was closed temporarily. That's what they told the public. But I knew it wouldn't hold them. You can't just lock away something that's been surviving underground for over a century. I was right. 2 weeks after the cave was sealed, a family in Nashville, about 90 miles away, reported strange noises in their basement. Then people started disappearing in Louisville. Cameras in city sewers started catching glimpses of pale figures moving in the darkness. The water table, Sarah explained during our last meeting. We forgot about the water table. They're following the underground rivers, finding new ways out through the drainage systems. Now, every city connected to these underground water systems is at risk. People are starting to notice things. Missing pets, strange sounds at night, scratching noises in the walls. The government installed heavy grates over sewer entrances, but the creatures just find other ways. They're patient. They're adaptable. Last week, I got a call from a friend at the water treatment plant. They found claw marks on pipes deep underground, fresh ones. And those clicking sounds, they're getting closer to the surface. I keep thinking about something one of the soldiers told me during the cave battle. He'd seen one of the creatures up close, an older one. It looked at him and spoke, actual words, in a raspy voice that hadn't been used in years. This was always our world, it said. The surface is just the beginning. I don't sleep well anymore. Every time I hear a strange noise at night or see a manhole cover that looks slightly moved, I wonder, are they down there, right now, under our feet? Are they watching, waiting, planning? The truth is, we didn't seal them in. We sealed ourselves out. And now, in every dark corner of every city, in every drainage pipe, and every old subway tunnel, they're spreading, evolving, growing stronger. Sometimes late at night, I think I hear clicking sounds coming from my basement. I never go down to check. I'll never forget the summer of 2016. I was working as a park ranger in California's Sierra National Forest, and everything seemed normal at first. Well, as normal as things could be during the worst drought we'd had in decades. The grass was brown, the streams were drying up, and everyone knew fire season would be rough. But none of us could have guessed just how different this fire season would be. It started with the smoke. Now, I'd seen plenty of smoke from forest fires before, but this was wrong. I was up in my observation tower one evening when I noticed something strange. The smoke wasn't rising straight up like it should. Instead, it was moving in circles, almost like it was, searching for something. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe I'd been in the sun too long. But then the reports started coming in. 2 hikers went missing near Eagle Lake. Then 3 more disappeared by Crystal Creek. The weird thing was, we couldn't find any signs of them getting lost or hurt. They just vanished. My friend Mike, another ranger, was the first one to see it clearly. He was doing his evening patrol when he radioed me, his voice shaking. "Sarah," he said, "you need to see this. The smoke? It's forming shapes. Like people, but not people. They're moving through the trees, and I swear they're looking for something." I grabbed my binoculars and rushed outside. That's when I saw it too. The smoke wasn't just drifting anymore. It was forming into dark figures that moved with purpose. They would gather together, then split apart, like hunters searching for prey. Every time they moved, the air got colder, even though it was the middle of summer. The next day, we found the first body. A hiker, but not like any fire victim I'd ever seen. The body wasn't just burned, it was completely covered in ash, like a statue. And the weird thing was, the trees around it weren't burned at all. Just that one spot, like something had picked its target very carefully. We tried to radio for help, to tell our supervisors what was happening. But who would believe us? How do you tell someone that smoke is hunting people, that fire is moving with intelligence? That's when we realized we were on our own, and things were only going to get worse. The day after that, I saw one of the smoke figures up close. I was checking on a campground we'd evacuated, and it just appeared in front of me. It was like looking at a person made of dark, swirling smoke, but where its eyes should have been, there were tiny flames. It reached out toward me, and I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. That's when we knew this wasn't just another fire season. This was something else entirely, something none of our training had prepared us for, and it was only the beginning. The next few days showed us just how bad things were getting. I was in my Ranger truck, driving through the park early one morning, when I saw something that made my blood run cold. The fire wasn't spreading like normal fires do, jumping from tree to tree in a random pattern. No, this fire was moving in straight lines, like someone drawing paths on the forest. I grabbed my radio to call it in when I heard screaming from the Blue Pine campground. I drove there as fast as I could. What I saw still gives me nightmares. The fire had made a perfect circle around the campground, trapping everyone inside. But that's not what scared me the most. The flames were moving against the wind. Every firefighter knows that's not possible, but I was watching it happen right in front of me. "Everyone get to the lake," I shouted, helping people grab their kids and run. An old firefighter named Bob was there too, and I saw his face go white as he watched the flames. 25 years fighting fires, he whispered, and I've never seen fire behave like this. It's like it's thinking. We managed to get most people into the water, but we lost 3 campers that day. The strange thing was, when we found them later, their bodies were completely covered in ash, just like that first hiker. And now these ash-covered bodies were starting to move. I didn't believe it at first. None of us did. But my friend Lisa from the North Station got it on video. The ash bodies would stand up after dark, walking through the forest like they were looking for something. Their footprints left tiny fires wherever they stepped. We tried telling our bosses, showing them videos and photos. They just said it was mass hysteria and stress from the extreme conditions. But we knew what we were seeing. The fire wasn't just burning anymore, it was hunting. The smoke creatures were getting bolder too. They started appearing in groups, herding people toward the flames like sheep. We found their pattern. They would show up at sunset, when the light was dim enough for them to move freely. They looked like dark shadows walking through the trees. But if you look closely, just then my radio crackled. It was Mike, and he sounded terrified. "Sarah, you need to see this. The smoke creatures, they're all moving in the same direction. And they're taking the ash people with them." I drove out to his location, and my heart nearly stopped. He was right. Dozens of smoke figures were gliding through the trees, and behind them, a line of ash revenants followed. They were all heading east toward the mountains. The death toll was getting scary. Over 2,000 people were missing or dead. The president declared a state of emergency in all 3 states. The army came in with tanks and helicopters, but their weapons just passed right through the smoke creatures. We tried everything we could think of. Water drops didn't work. Fire breaks didn't stop them. Even special chemical fire suppressants just made them angry. One old firefighter had an idea that actually helped a little. He remembered how salt was used to purify things in old stories, so we tried spreading salt lines around evacuation centers. It worked. The smoke creatures couldn't cross them. Finally, we had some way to protect people, even if it was just temporary. But we were running out of time. Every person the fire took came back as an ash revenant, making their army bigger, and now they were all gathering together, like they were preparing for something. Dr. Rodriguez found one last piece of information in an old diary. It described how the last time this happened, all the fire spirits joined together to make something huge, something terrible. "They're not just burning the forest," she said quietly. "They're gathering strength. And if the old stories are true, what comes next is much, much worse." That's when we got the call that changed everything. A ranger in the mountains had spotted something massive moving in the smoke. Something that made the ground shake when it walked. The fire that hunts wasn't just awake anymore. It was getting ready to show us its true form. What happened next still haunts my dreams. I was standing with Mike on Firewatch Hill when we saw it begin. All the smoke creatures from miles around were flowing together like rivers of dark smoke, all heading to one spot in the mountains. The ash revenants were walking there too, hundreds of them, moving in straight lines like soldiers. The sky turned a deep, angry red, and the air got so hot it was hard to breathe. "Look," Mike pointed at the mountain. The smoke was taking shape, growing taller and taller. First, it was as high as the trees, then as tall as a building, then even bigger. It was forming into something massive, a giant figure made of smoke and fire. I grabbed my radio with shaking hands. "Command, this is Ranger Sarah. You need to see this. The smoke. It's all coming together." The giant figure must have been as tall as a skyscraper. It had a head wrapped in flames, arms made of thick black smoke, and wherever it stepped, the ground turned to ash. This was what the ancient stories warned about, the fire spirit's true form. The army tried to stop it. They sent in helicopters with water tanks and planes with fire retardant. But the giant just waved its arm, and a wall of fire knocked them away like toys. Tanks fired at it, but their shells just passed through the smoke. The salt, I remembered suddenly. If salt stops the small ones, maybe. We didn't have enough salt to make a line around something so big. But there was another way. I grabbed my radio again. "Command, what if we got the planes to drop salt water from the ocean instead of fresh water?" They agreed to try. Within an hour, military planes were dumping tons of salt water on the giant. It worked, a little. Wherever the salt water hit, the smoke giant's form wavered and weakened. But it wasn't enough. The giant kept walking, heading straight for the nearest city. Every step it took left burning footprints half a mile wide. The smoke creatures and ash revenants followed it like an army. Then something strange happened. Dark clouds started gathering overhead. Real rain clouds, not smoke. For the first time in months, the sky was preparing for rain. The giant seemed to notice. It raised its burning arms toward the clouds like it was trying to push them away. But more clouds kept coming. The first drops of rain fell just as the giant reached the city limits. Where the rain hit its smoke body, bits of it started breaking apart. It let out a roar that shook the windows of every building for miles. More rain fell, heavier now. The giant's form started dissolving, like ink washing away in water. The smaller smoke creatures were disappearing too, and the ash revenants were crumbling back into piles of ash. But even as it was falling apart, the giant spoke. Its voice sounded like 1,000 fires burning at once. We will return. When the land dries, when you forget, we will wake again. You could see faces in the smoke, twisted and angry. One night, I found an old man living alone in a cabin deep in the park. When I told him we needed to evacuate, he just nodded slowly. They've woken up again, he said quietly. The fire spirits. My grandfather told me stories about them, but I never thought. He grabbed a few things and came with me without arguing. By the end of the week, the fire had spread to 3 different parks, and we were getting reports of smoke creatures and walking ash bodies from all of them. The news was calling it a mysterious fire pattern, but those of us on the ground knew the truth. Something ancient had woken up in our forests, something that knew how to use fire as a weapon, and it was getting stronger every day. Things got worse fast. The fire started jumping our containment lines like they weren't even there. Not just small jumps, we're talking miles at a time. One minute an area would be safe, the next it would burst into flames with no warning. I was driving back from warning a small town when I saw my first ash revenant up close. That's what we started calling the burned bodies that came back. It was standing in the middle of the road, completely gray and covered in ash. When it turned to look at me, tiny flames flickered in its eye sockets. I reversed my truck so fast I nearly drove into a ditch. The really scary part, it started following me. Not running, just walking steadily, leaving little fires with each step. No matter how fast I drove, when I looked in my mirror, it was still coming. That same day, Mike called me about something he found. An old Native American cave painting deep in the park. It showed tall figures made of smoke and fire, with smaller figures running away from them. At the bottom were symbols that looked like they were trying to warn about something. Sarah, Mike's voice was shaking. The date markings on these paintings, they show this happening before. Every few hundred years when the land gets super dry. It's like the fire is alive, and the drought wakes it up. The fire kept spreading, faster than any normal fire should. Soon it wasn't just our park. Reports started coming in from Oregon and Nevada too. The same strange behavior, the same smoke creatures, the same ash revenants walking around at night. People finally started believing us when a news helicopter caught footage of smoke figures herding people toward a wall of fire. After that, the evacuations began. Not just camping areas anymore. Entire towns had to leave. The roads were packed with cars, everyone trying to get away. I'll never forget what I saw at the Carson Valley evacuation. We were helping people onto buses when the smoke creatures appeared all around us. But this time, something was different. The ash revenants were walking among them, and they seemed to be working together. One little girl pointed at them and said something that gave me chills. "Mommy, the smoke people are talking to each other." She was right. We could hear it, a soft whisper that sounded like crackling flames, passing between the smoke figures and the ash revenants. They were communicating, making plans. The National Guard came in to help, but their water drops and fire breaks didn't do much good. How do you fight a fire that thinks? That can move wherever it wants. That can turn its victims into more soldiers for its army. I found another ranger crying in his truck that evening. "It's spreading too fast," he said. "It's like the whole forest is turning against us." Looking out at the red sky that night, I realized he was right. This wasn't just a fire anymore. It was starting to feel like a war, and we were losing badly. The scariest part, we started noticing patterns. The smoke creatures weren't just randomly attacking. They were gathering people together, like they were collecting them for something worse that was coming. We just didn't know what it was yet, but we were about to find out. I was helping at the Emergency Command Center when Dr. Rodriguez, a fire researcher, burst in with a stack of old books. She'd been studying ancient stories about fires, and what she found made my skin crawl. This has happened before, she said, spreading out old newspapers and photos on the table. Every few hundred years, when the land gets dry enough, the native people here knew about it. They called it the fire that hunts. She showed us pictures from the 1800s, drawings that looked exactly like our smoke creatures. Then she pulled out more recent photos from a fire in 1923. Same thing. People described smoke that moved like it was alive and burned bodies that got up and walked. But here's the really important part, she said, pointing to an old map. They didn't just appear randomly. They were all building up to something bigger. Then the rain really poured down, and the giant collapsed into nothing but steam and regular smoke. The fires all around started going out, one by one. We thought it was over. We were wrong. The rain fell for 3 days straight. When it finally stopped, most of the fires were out. Everyone thought we'd won. I wish that had been true. A week later, I was checking the burned areas with Mike when we saw something that made us realize this wasn't over. In the early morning fall, we spotted what looked like thin wisps of smoke moving between the trees. But there weren't any fires burning anymore. They didn't all go away, Mike whispered. Some of them are still here, hiding. He was right. The rain had destroyed the giant and most of his army, but some of the smoke creatures had survived. They were weaker now, but they were waiting, watching, and sometimes on really quiet nights, we could still hear them whispering to each other. The official story was that it had been a rare weather event and unusual fire patterns. The government cleaned up the ash piles that used to be revenants. They rebuilt the burned towns. They told everyone it was safe now. But those of us who were there know better. I still have the old photos Dr. Rodriguez found. I keep them with my own pictures from that summer, proof that this wasn't the first time and won't be the last. The old man from the cabin came to see me before he moved away. He looked at the dry hills and shook his head. They'll be back, he said. Maybe not next year, maybe not for 100 years. But when the land gets dry enough again, they'll wake up. The fire that hunts never really dies. He was right about that too. Every fire season now, I watch the smoke extra carefully. Most of the time it's normal, just regular fire and regular smoke. But sometimes when the wind is just right and the air is very dry, I see shapes in the smoke. They're still out there, growing stronger, waiting for the right moment to return. Last week, a new ranger asked me why I keep a bag of salt in my truck. I told her it was just in case. She laughed, but I saw something in her eyes. A shadow of doubt, like maybe she'd seen something strange in the smoke too. The really scary part, the droughts are getting worse every year. The land is getting drier, just like the giant said before it disappeared. When the land dries, when you forget, we will wake again. Most people have already forgotten what really happened in 2016. They'd convinced themselves it wasn't real, but some of us remember. We watch the smoke. We keep salt handy, and we know that somewhere out there, in the deepest parts of the forest, the smoke creatures are patient. They're waiting for their next fire season, and next time, they'll be ready. I never thought I'd be writing this down, but people need to know what's happening on the Appalachian Trail. My name's Mike, and I've been a park ranger here for 12 years. Everything was normal until last spring. It started with hikers coming to my station, confused and scared. They'd show me their GPS screens, and nothing made sense. The trails on their devices would twist and turn in ways that didn't match our maps. At first, I told them it was just a GPS glitch. You know how technology can be in the mountains. But then Jenny Martinez went missing. She was an experienced hiker, the kind who plans everything perfectly. Her last selfie showed her standing at Baker's Point, except Baker's Point isn't where it used to be. In the photo, the rocks were different, turned at an impossible angle. We found her backpack 2 days later, 5 miles away, but Jenny was gone. More people started disappearing. 10 in the first month, then 30. We searched everywhere, but the weird thing was how the trail kept changing. I'd walk a path I've known for years, only to find it leading somewhere completely different. Then I saw it, the thing that still keeps me up at night. I was searching for a missing family when I found what looked like a person bent into a weird shape. As I got closer, I realized it was Sarah Chen. a hiker who disappeared a week earlier. She was twisted, not dead, but not really alive either. Her body was curved like a trail marker, pointing deeper into the woods. Her eyes were open, but they weren't blinking. I radioed for help, but when the rescue team arrived an hour later, she was gone. Just gone. But the trail had a new curve exactly where she had been standing. That's when we knew something was terribly wrong. The trail wasn't just a path anymore. It was changing, growing, and it was using us to do it. By summer, the missing persons count hit 200. The FBI came in, but they were just as confused as we were. They'd set up motion sensors and cameras, but the footage made no sense. Paths would appear and disappear. Time didn't work right. One camera would show morning, while another right next to it showed night. I'm writing this from my cabin now. Tomorrow, they're sending in a team of scientists to study what's happening. But I can hear it at night, the sound of dirt moving, of rocks shifting. The trail is changing again. And sometimes, when it's really quiet, I swear I can hear them, all those missing people, their whispers carried on the wind, calling others to join them on these endless, hungry paths. The scientists arrived in their white vans on a foggy Tuesday morning. I watched them unload all sorts of equipment, nothing fancy, just regular stuff like cameras, measuring tapes, and some devices that could track temperature changes. Dr. Lisa Chen was in charge, and she talked to me like a normal person, not using big words like most scientists do. "Mike, we need you to show us where you saw the trail changes," she said, checking her regular hiking boots. At least they came prepared for actual hiking, not some fancy lab work. I took them to where Jenny had disappeared. The trail looked normal that morning, but something felt off. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and know someone's watching you? It was like that, but everywhere. Dr. Chen's team set up their equipment. They put cameras on trees and buried some sensors in the ground. One of them, Tom, carried an old-fashioned compass. Smart thinking. GPS doesn't work right here anymore. That's when we met Brian, a hiker who stumbled out of the woods. He looked tired and scared, like he hadn't slept in days. His clothes were dirty, but they weren't as worn as they should have been for someone who said he'd been lost for 2 weeks. "I kept walking in circles," Brian told us, his hands shaking as he held a cup of hot coffee. The sun would rise and set 3 times in what felt like an hour. I saw the same tree over and over, but each time it was older, like I was seeing it age right in front of me. Dr. Chen's equipment started showing weird readings. The temperature would drop to freezing in one spot, while 3 feet away it was summer hot. Timestamps on their cameras didn't match. One would show 3:00 p.m. Another right next to it would show 3:00 a.m. But the scariest part came when we found the footprints. They started normal, then twisted sideways up a tree, across its branches, and back down another tree, like someone had walked through a world where up and down didn't matter anymore. That evening, Tom disappeared while checking the sensors. We heard him scream, but it sounded like it came from everywhere at once. When we ran to help, we only found his notebook. The last thing he wrote sent chills down my spine. "The trail isn't on the mountain. The mountain is on the trail." The local news started covering the story. People were scared, but curious too. More hikers came, wanting to see the strange trails for themselves. We tried to stop them, put up warning signs, but they kept coming. That's when Dr. Chen made the connection. She noticed that every time someone disappeared, a new path would form. The trail wasn't just taking people, it was using them to grow. I sit here in the research base camp now, watching the monitors. The numbers don't lie. The trail is changing faster, getting stronger. And somewhere out there, Tom is probably twisted into another trail marker, pointing the way for more people to vanish. Dr. Chen just radioed in. They found something in the soil samples, something old, really old, and she says we need to look at some local history books right away. Something about ancient stories of paths that hunt. Dr. Chen found some old books in the town library. Not the normal tourist guides, but dusty journals written by the first settlers who came here. They wrote about something that made my skin crawl. The Native Americans never built permanent trails on these mountains. They said the paths made themselves. The old stories talk about hungry roads, Dr. Chen told me, her voice shaking a little as she read from her notes. They say paths would appear overnight, leading people away. Those who followed them never came back. We invited Billy Redcloud, a local tribal elder, to help us understand more. He came to our camp carrying just a walking stick and a serious look on his face. When he saw our maps showing where people disappeared, he wasn't surprised at all. My grandfather's grandfather knew about this, Billy said, pointing at the mountain with his stick. These aren't trails. They're more like veins. And the mountain? It's not a mountain. It's been sleeping, feeding slowly, for thousands of years. That's when our radios started crackling with panic. A Boy Scout troop of 12 kids and 3 adults had gone missing near Echo Ridge. But here's the thing. Echo Ridge didn't exist yesterday. It was just empty forest. Now there was a whole new trail there, complete with signs that looked decades old. We rushed to the spot with Billy. The dirt on the new trail looked old and packed down, like it had been there forever. But the really scary part, we found candy bar wrappers from the scout troop scattered along the path, wrappers that somehow looked like they'd been lying there for years, faded and crumbling. Billy knelt down and put his hand on the ground. It's not just taking them, he said quietly. It's taking their time too. Their years, their lives. That's how it feeds. Dr. Chen's team brought out special cameras that could take pictures of heat patterns. The photos showed something that made us all step back. The trails were warm like veins in a living thing. And they were all connected, pulsing with a slow rhythm, like a heartbeat. We found more old stories in the library. Every few hundred years, more people would go missing on the mountain. The trails would grow, spread out, then go quiet again, like a huge animal waking up just long enough to eat. But this time was different. The numbers were getting worse, way worse. Yesterday alone, 47 people vanished. The trails are spreading faster than ever, forming new paths every day. And now we know why. All our modern hiking gear, GPS devices, and trail markers, we've been helping it, making it stronger, feeding it without knowing. I'm writing this from the emergency command center they set up in town. The governor just declared a state of emergency, but I don't think they understand what we're dealing with. You can't fight a trail. You can't bob a path. How do you kill something that can turn the ground under your feet into a trap? Billy just walked in. He looks worried. Says he needs to show us something in the oldest part of the forest. Something about stone markers his ancestors left, warning about what happens when the trails finally finish waking up. Billy led us to a circle of stones deep in the woods. The rocks had strange marks carved into them that reminded me of trail maps. But these maps showed paths that don't exist yet, or didn't until today. The army showed up this morning. Big trucks, serious faces, and lots of guns. I wanted to tell them guns wouldn't help against something that can turn the ground into a trap, but they wouldn't listen. We'll handle this, their commander said. They set up explosives to destroy the main trail sections. I watched from the command post as they pressed the button. The explosions were huge, sending dirt and rocks flying everywhere. But when the dust cleared, my heart sank. The trails were still there, unchanged. No, not unchanged. They were bigger now, like the explosion had fed them somehow. The paths had grown wider, and new ones had appeared where the soldiers had walked. That's when the radio calls started coming in from all over. New trail appearing in downtown Atlanta. Boston reporting trail activity in the city park. Chicago has moving pathways in Grant Park. The trails weren't just on our mountain anymore. They were spreading everywhere, appearing in cities, crossing highways, showing up in people's backyards. The news showed videos of sidewalks twisting into new shapes, park paths changing direction when people weren't looking. Dr. Chen's equipment started going crazy. All the trails were connecting, forming a giant web across the country. The temperature readings, the strange time problems, everything was getting worse. It's not just waking up, Billy said, looking at the stone markers again. It's hungry, really hungry, and we've been making it stronger for years with our maps and trails and hiking paths. The president came on TV and told everyone to stay away from all trails, paths, or walkways. But how do you do that in a world full of roads and sidewalks? People started seeing their garden paths move at night. Kids reported playground tracks that led to nowhere. Yesterday, we lost contact with 3 small towns. Just gone. The roads leading to them turned into twisted loops that never reached their destination. GPS shows the town still exists, but anyone who tries to drive there ends up right back where they started. I'm writing this from a helicopter now. We're flying over the Appalachian Trail, or what's left of it. The whole mountain range looks different. The paths have grown so wide they've become like rivers made of dirt, flowing and changing. Below us, I can see new trails being born, spreading like cracks in dried mud. The pilot just pointed something out that made my blood run cold. All these trails, these thousands of paths spreading across the country. From up here, they're starting to form a pattern. They look like a giant spider web. And in the middle of it all, the Appalachian Trail is pulsing like a massive heart. Billy grabs my arm and points down. There's movement on the trails, but it's not hikers. The trails themselves are moving, like huge snakes made of dirt and stone, and they're all moving in the same direction, toward the cities. We need to land, Billy says urgently. I need to show you the last stone marker, the one that shows what happens when the network is complete. We couldn't land the helicopter. The ground below us was moving too much. But through the window, I saw the last stone marker. The carvings showed a map of trails covering everything, and stick figures being pulled into the earth. Billy was right. This was more than just disappearing trails. This was something waking up after sleeping for thousands of years. The radio crackled with Dr. Chen's voice. Mike, the readings are off the charts. It's all connecting. Every trail, every path, they're all becoming one thing. That's when it happened. Every trail in America moved at once. People screamed as sidewalks cracked open. Roads twisted like rubber bands. Even tiny paths in parks started pulling people in, like quicksand made of dirt and stone. From our helicopter, I watched in horror as the trails pulsed with a deep blue light. The same light we saw in the heat camera pictures, but now everyone could see it. The paths looked like glowing veins on the surface of the earth. Look at the cities, our pilot shouted. In New York, paths were growing up the sides of buildings. In Chicago, trail markers made of twisted people pointed toward Lake Michigan, where new paths were forming on the water itself. The Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco had turned into one giant trail, looping impossibly in the air. The military tried everything: bombs, flamethrowers, even trying to pave over the trails with concrete. Nothing worked. The paths would just appear somewhere else, stronger than before. Dr. Chen's last message still haunts me. It's not just paths anymore. It's turning the whole country into one giant trail network. And it's still hungry. That was 3 days ago. Now I'm writing this from a safe room in NORAD, deep underground. But even here, we can feel the ground shifting. The trails are going deeper, burrowing through the earth like roots. The president ordered everyone to stay inside, away from any paths. But it's too late. New trails form inside buildings now. People report finding paths in their basements that weren't there before, leading down into darkness. The scariest part: the missing people count is now over 3,400, and Billy says this is just the beginning. The ancient stories warn that once the trail network fully awakens, it will spread across the whole world. Yesterday, we got reports of new trails appearing in Europe, then Asia, then everywhere. The whole planet is being covered in hungry paths that want to lead people away. I have to end this story here. The general says we need to evacuate. They found a new trail forming in the hallway outside our safe room. But before I go, let me warn you. If you see a path you don't remember being there before, don't take it, no matter how safe it looks, no matter where it seems to lead. Because now we know the truth. Every trail is connected. Every path is part of it. And it's not just awake anymore. It's starving. End of report. P.S. If you're reading this, they're closing all the national parks and major trails. But it won't help. We can't close something that makes its own paths. Just remember, the next time you see a new shortcut, a strange path, or even a weird bend in the road, it might be looking right back at you. I never thought I'd be the one to discover something this terrifying. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm supposed to be just a normal scientist who studies heat patterns under Yellowstone National Park. You know, the place with all the pretty geysers and hot springs. Well, I wish that's all it was. It started 3 months ago when my team got some weird readings from our new thermal cameras. At first, we thought our equipment was broken. The heat patterns under the park weren't acting like they should. Instead of staying still or moving in the way hot water normally does, they were pulsing, like a heartbeat. Hey Mike, come look at this. I called to my research partner one cold morning. These patterns don't make any sense. Mike pushed his glasses up and stared at my computer screen. The red and orange blobs on the thermal map were shifting in ways we'd never seen before. That's different, he said, which is science speak for what the heck. But it got weirder. While checking old park records for any similar patterns, I found something that made my stomach turn. People had been disappearing in Yellowstone for centuries, way more than in other national parks. And not just a few people here and there. We're talking about over 12,000 missing persons. The strange thing was, these disappearances followed a pattern. They'd spike every few decades, then stop completely for years, just like the heat patterns we were seeing now. That's when Jenny, our history expert, found something in the old Native American records. The local tribes had warned the first white settlers about Yellowstone. They didn't call it a park. They called it the Sleeping One. I remember sitting in our research cabin that night, looking through the old documents with shaking hands. The tribal elders had drawn pictures of something massive living under the park. They said all the hot springs and geysers weren't natural features at all. They were parts of it, like breathing holes and eyes. We laughed it off at first. Ancient legends, we said. But then we compared those old drawings to our thermal images. The match was perfect, too perfect. That night, as I lay in my bunk listening to the distant rumble of geysers, a horrible thought hit me. What if we weren't studying Yellowstone? What if Yellowstone was studying us? The next morning, our equipment picked up the biggest heat surge yet, and somewhere in the park, 3 more tourists went missing. This was just the beginning. I wish I could say it got better after that, but when you're dealing with something that's been eating people for centuries, better isn't really an option. And now, as I write this, I can feel the ground shaking beneath my feet. The pattern we discovered shows it's waking up, really waking up. And this time, it's hungry. Our team spent the next 2 weeks trying to understand what we were dealing with. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those heat patterns moving like a giant beast beneath the park. One morning, while checking our cameras, I noticed something that made my heart stop. Old Faithful, the famous geyser that tourists love to watch, wasn't just spouting water randomly. Its eruptions matched perfectly with the movement patterns we detected underground, like a breath. Guys, I called out to my team, my voice shaking. You need to see this. We gathered around the monitors, watching in silence as I played back the footage. Every time the heat pattern moved, a geyser would erupt somewhere in the park. It wasn't just Old Faithful, it was all of them. It's like they're all connected, Jenny whispered, like parts of the same thing. Mike pulled up some old maps on his tablet. Look at this, he said, pointing to drawings from the 1800s. The first explorers thought these hot springs were eyes watching them. What if they were right? That's when we started matching disappearance records with geyser activity. The pattern was clear. People went missing most often when the underground heat patterns were most active, like it was feeding. But the scariest part came when we tried to tell people what we found. Park officials wouldn't listen. Government scientists hung up on us. One ranger even laughed and said, "Next, you'll tell me Bigfoot is real." Then the dream started. Every night, more of our team members reported the same dream. Standing at the edge of a hot spring, feeling something huge stirring beneath their feet, hearing the deep rumble that seemed to come from miles below. I had that dream too. But in mine, I also heard words. Not spoken words, more like feelings pushed into my brain. Ancient, hungry feelings. They told me this had happened before, many times before, and it would happen again. We set up sensors all around the park, hoping to track this thing's movements. That's when we lost our first team member. Tom, our geology expert, went to check a sensor near Mammoth Hot Springs. He radioed in that he was picking up strange vibrations. Then his radio went silent. We found his equipment 2 days later. Just his equipment. The park ranger said he probably fell into a hot spring. But I knew better. The thermal imaging from that day showed a massive heat signature moving right where Tom had been standing. Whatever this thing is, Mike said as we stared at the data, it's getting more active, and I don't think it's going back to sleep this time. He was right. The heat patterns were growing stronger every day. More tourists were reporting strange sounds, like deep breathing coming from the ground. And the dreams? Everyone in the park was having them now. We weren't just scientists anymore. We had become witnesses to something impossible, something that had been hiding in plain sight for centuries. And now it was waking up. The worst part, we were the only ones who knew what was coming. But knowing about a disaster doesn't mean you can stop it. Sometimes, it just means you have to watch it happen. And this disaster was about to get much, much worse. Everything changed when we found the old government files. Jenny discovered them hidden in a dusty corner of the park's archive room, reports dating back to the 1930s. As I read them, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. They knew. I whispered to Mike and Jenny. They've always known. The files showed that every few decades, the thing under Yellowstone would wake up and feed. The government didn't just hide it. They helped cover it up. All those missing people were listed as natural park accidents or wildlife encounters. But the real shock came when we calculated the actual number of victims. The official count of 12,000 was way too low. The real number was closer to 30,000 people over the centuries. That's an entire small town of missing people. One night, as we were reviewing the data, the ground started shaking. Not like a normal earthquake. This was different. The vibrations had a pattern, like massive muscle movements deep underground. "Sarah, look at this." Mike called out, pointing at our monitors. The heat signatures were forming a shape we'd never seen before, a massive spiral pattern, with the park's geysers at specific points along it. "It's not random," Jenny said, her voice barely a whisper. "Those geysers, they're like pressure valves. And they're all opening at once." That's when we lost power to our research station. In the sudden darkness, we could hear something that still haunts my dreams. A deep, low humming coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I turned on my flashlight and saw condensation forming on our windows. The temperature outside was dropping rapidly, even though our sensors showed the ground was getting hotter. Then we heard the scream. Lisa, our newest team member, had been checking equipment outside. We found her standing frozen near a small hot spring, staring into the bubbling water. "I saw it," she kept saying. "I saw its eye." When we got her back inside, Lisa told us something that made everything click. The hot spring's surface hadn't just been bubbling. It had been focusing, like a pupil adjusting to light. The ancient tribes were right. These weren't just hot springs. They were eyes. And now they were all opening. That night, 5 more tourists disappeared near Old Faithful. The official report called it a wandering off trail incident, but we had the thermal images. We saw the heat signature surge just before they vanished. We saw what really happened. Mike stayed up all night running calculations. When morning came, his face was pale. "It's not just waking up," he said, showing me the data. "It's building up to something. All these patterns, these disappearances, they're like tremors before an earthquake. But this is going to be bigger than anything we've seen." "How long?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know the answer. "Based on the energy readings?" He looked at me with tired eyes. "Days, maybe less." As if to confirm his words, the ground gave another low rumble. In the distance, we could hear Old Faithful erupting, way ahead of its normal schedule. Jenny walked in with the morning park report. 3 more missing persons cases overnight. The rangers were starting to look worried. They couldn't explain why so many people were vanishing at once. But we knew. We knew exactly what was happening. The real question was, what could we possibly do about it? It turns out, facing an ancient horror isn't like in the movies. There's no secret weakness to discover, no last-minute hero moment. There's just the terrible truth and the even more terrible question of who to tell. And who would even believe us? We tried everything we could think of to warn people. I called newspaper reporters, TV stations, and even posted our findings online. Nobody took us seriously. They all said the same thing. It's just normal park activity. But there was nothing normal about what happened next. It started on a Tuesday morning. I was looking at our thermal screens when all our sensors went crazy at once. The temperature underground jumped so high it broke some of our equipment. Everyone needs to see this, I said into our team radio. But before anyone could answer, the ground started shaking. Not like the small tremors we felt before. This was like the whole park was coming alive. Mike burst into the room. Sarah, Old Faithful just erupted black water, and it's not stopping. We rushed outside. The sight made my stomach drop. All across the park, geysers were shooting up dark liquid. The air smelled like rotten eggs, worse than the usual sulfur smell. Tourists were pointing their phones at the sky, not realizing they needed to run. That's when the park rangers finally started to believe us. They began evacuating visitors, but it was already getting hard to leave. Roads were cracking. New hot springs were opening up everywhere, trapping people between them. The entity is pushing upward, Jenny said, looking at our latest readings. It's like it's stretching after a long sleep. We lost contact with the east side of the park first. The radio just went dead. When we checked the thermal cameras, that whole area was one massive heat signature. Whatever was down there, it was rising. Lisa, still shaken from seeing the eye earlier, pointed at something on the screen. Look at the pattern, she whispered. It's not random movement anymore. It's coordinated. She was right. The heat patterns were moving like muscles flexing. The whole park was shifting like a giant creature taking its first deep breath. We tried to drive out to warn some campers, but had to turn back. The road ahead of us just disappeared, sank right into the ground, leaving a steaming crack. Back at our research station, Mike was getting readings from his backup sensors. Goddess, he said, his voice shaking. Remember how we thought it was waking up? This isn't just waking up. This is it. The real thing. The big feed. As if answering him, a deep rumble shook the building. Pictures fell off walls. Equipment crashed to the floor. Through the window, we watched in horror as the ground in the distance started to bulge upward. We need to get out of here, Jenny said. But as she spoke, the lights went out. In the darkness, we could hear something that wasn't quite a sound, more like a feeling in our heads. Ancient, hungry, aware. When emergency power came on, our thermal screens showed something impossible. The entire park was now one giant heat signature, and it was pulsing. It's too late to stop it, Mike said, staring at the data. But maybe we can at least document what's happening. For next time, for whoever comes after. That's when we made our choice. Most of the team left. I'd insisted they go, but Mike, Jenny, and I stayed behind. Someone had to record what was happening. Someone had to warn the future. Through the window, we could see the night sky turning orange from all the geysers. The ground wouldn't stop shaking. And somewhere in the darkness, we could hear people screaming. The thing that had slept under Yellowstone for so long was finally getting up. And we were about to see exactly what that meant. I'm writing this part now because I don't know if we'll be able to later. If you're reading this, you need to know what happened next. You need to know what we found out about stopping it. Because the worst part, this isn't the end. It's just the beginning. The first light of dawn showed us what our world had become. The park we knew was gone. In its place was something from a nightmare. The ground had split open in hundreds of places. Steam and dark water shot into the sky everywhere we looked. The air was so hot it hurt to breathe. And in the middle of it all, something massive was moving under the earth. Look at the data. Mike shouted over the noise. The pattern, it's different now. He was right. The heat signatures had changed. Instead of spreading out, they were all moving toward one spot, like water draining into a giant sink. That's when Jenny figured it out. She'd been studying the old tribal stories all night. They didn't just know about this thing, she said, her face lit by the glow of emergency lights. They knew how to make it go back to sleep. According to the stories, the tribes had learned that the entity followed natural cycles, like the seasons or the tides. They couldn't kill it. It was too big, too old, too powerful. But they could convince it to rest again. The drums, Jenny said, pointing to a picture in an old book. They used to play special rhythms that matched its movements, like a lullaby for a monster. It sounded crazy, but right then, crazy was all we had. We rigged up every speaker we could find. Jenny programmed them to make deep, rhythmic sounds that matched the entity's pulse rate from our sensors. We blasted that sound across the park. For a long time, nothing happened. The ground kept shaking. The heat kept rising. We thought we had failed. Then we noticed something. The heat patterns were changing. Slowly, very slowly, they started matching our rhythm. It's working, Mike yelled. The energy readings are dropping. But our victory didn't last long. One of our backup generators failed, taking half the speakers with it. The rhythm broke. The response was immediate. The ground heaved like an angry animal. Our research station started to crack apart. We can't stop it, I realized then. We can only make it wait. As the building began to collapse, we grabbed our most important data and ran. Behind us, the research station disappeared into a new crack in the earth. We made it to one of the emergency helicopters the Park Service had left. As we flew away, we could see the true scale of what was happening. The whole park looked like it was breathing. That was 3 days ago. The entity is still active, but moving slower now. The official story is that it's just a series of natural disasters, but we know better. We've been running calculations nonstop. Based on the patterns we've seen, we can predict when it will wake up again, 2025. That gives us some time, but not much. I'm writing this report so someone will know the truth. We've hidden copies in secure places, along with all our data and the tribal recordings. Here's what you need to know if you find this. You can't kill it. Don't try. It's been here longer than humans have existed. The rhythms help. We've included the frequencies that work best. It follows a pattern. We've mapped it out. The next wave will start in the spring of 2025. When you see the signs, the heat changes, the dreams, the missing people, you'll know it's starting again. Most importantly, don't think you can stop it completely. The best we can do is help it sleep a little longer. Buy more time. Protect as many people as we can. I'm staying in the area, watching the sensors we managed to save. Mike and Jenny are too. Someone has to keep track. Someone has to be ready, because it will wake up again. And next time, we need to be better prepared. If you're reading this, consider it a warning and a responsibility. The ancient thing under Yellowstone is sleeping again, but it's still hungry, and it's already dreaming of its next meal. End report, Dr. Sarah Chan, lead researcher, Yellowstone Thermal Survey Project.